Chapter 148. A few days later, Tai Ziyuan arrived at the southwest part of Jingzhou. The boundless, jade-green sea stretched out from the silver beach into the distance, all the way to the horizon. The sea water on the beach was like a lover's hand gently caressing the white sand. Looking at this beautiful scene, people might feel that the sea was vast and the sky was clear. There were 2 white recliners under the umbrellas. In the woods behind the beach, there were many bodyguards from the Black Eagle Security Company. They were vigilantly watching their surroundings. Butler Jean, who was already old, stood calmly under the eaves of the beach terrace. He was avoiding the strong sunlight at dusk and the conversation between the young people on the 2 white recliners. "I didn't think about your current mental state before I came here. I thought that the girl's unfortunate death would make you depressed for many days." Tai Ziyuan, who was wearing a white linen shirt, calmly looked at Su Le beside him. He found that although Su Li's eyes were slightly sunken and his face was not as rosy as before, at least he was still mentally strong. Zhang Xiaomeng's death was not normal. The spaceship lost control of the spaceship and fell to the ground, turning into a firework. After the incident, there was no evidence of tampering. The government's investigation could only conclude that it was an accident. However, Zhang Xiaomeng's name was on the list of deceased passengers. People like Tai Ziyuan naturally understood the reason behind this incident immediately. The various departments of the government investigated the assassination at the Linhai State Gymnasium in different directions. Most of the officials focused on the Deputy Minister of National Defense, Yang Jinsong, who had committed suicide. They also found out about the director of the Linhai HTD Bureau, Shi Qinghai, and inexplicably uncovered a spy network of the anti-government army. However, Tai Ziyuan knew that the assassination attempt on him could not have been related to the anti-government army. Deputy Minister Yang could not have cooperated with the people in Green Dragon Mountain. The real mastermind was someone else. The government needed to find a scapegoat to answer to the Tai family. On the surface, the Tai family had no other evidence, so they could only accept the results of the government's investigation. However, the officials under the influence of the madam had already begun to investigate the remaining clues. When the investigation of the truth was gradually getting closer to the truth, there was a method to eliminate evidence and link. Zhang Xiaomeng's death was undoubtedly a ruthless method of silencing. The afternoon sun in Jingzhou was still a bit hot. Tai Ziyuan's usually pale face had 2 patches of red on it. It was probably due to the high temperature and had nothing to do with health. Like Su Le beside him, after asking a question, he began to become silent. He squinted his eyes and stared at the blue sea where seagulls occasionally flew by. The girl in the blue dress at the Double Moon Festival ball was dead. A trace of complex emotions flashed through Tai Ziyuan's eyes. If it wasn't for his family's insistence on investigating in secret and gradually threatening the other side, Zhang Xiaomeng, who wasn't that important, but played an important role in the information of the assassination, should still be alive, right? Tai Ziyuan thought this, but he didn't feel any guilt or heaviness in his heart. Although he wasn't old, he already had a calmness that people his age didn't have. The word calmness could also be called indifference in certain circumstances. Can the police find any clues? Su Le, who had been silent all this time, finally opened his mouth and asked, "Although I know that things like politics are very dark, a Federation councillor committed such a crime. Is there no one who can punish him? Then what is the use of the Federation's laws?" Tai Ziyuan's squinted eyes gradually opened. He glanced at Su Le with surprise. He thought that Su Le didn't know about Zhang Xiaomeng's background and many of the details of this entire incident, so he didn't know how the other knew that Councillor Macklin was behind this. "I might know more than you think." Su Le looked at the fine sand in his toes and said, "So I know who did this. The Federation's laws are very particular about evidence, and those politicians never leave behind any direct evidence that could be used against them." Tai Ziyuan looked at Su Le. After a long silence, he said in a serious tone, "The investigation of the militants directly led to the suicide of 7 officers of the 2nd Military Region. Even if the Federation can find some clues about this accident, I believe that it definitely won't be enough to send the culprit to court. What I am very curious about is why you are so sure that the culprit behind this is that Counselor Macklin. Logic, intuition, who will benefit from this? Sulu narrowed his eyes under the sunlight, his toes lightly squeezing the sand. He lowered his head and said, he is already running for vice president. How can someone like this become the leader of the Federation? Without evidence, it is very difficult to do anything. Tai Ziyuan said calmly, if I have someone release this news, not many people in the Federation will believe it. His image has always been very good, and perhaps this will give him a chance to build momentum, portraying himself as an innocent politician who was framed by the 7 families. Counselor Macklin will definitely be very happy. I am wondering if you will also become this kind of politician in the future. At this time, Sulu raised his head and looked seriously at Tai Ziyuan. This pair of eyes was very calm, very honest, and very thorough. Tai Ziyuan's expression became serious. After a while, he said very seriously, necessary means and compromises are all necessary, but I have my bottom line. I also have my bottom line. It is just that I am a small figure, and you are a big figure. When a small figure's bottom line is broken, he can only be angry, but there is nothing he can do. Sulu lowered his head and said, I know that you still remember that you still owe me a life. If possible, I hope that you will do your best to prevent that counselor from being successfully elected. This way, we will be even. Tai Ziyuan looked quietly at Sulu, the only friend in his life, the young man who had unhesitatingly stood in front of him at a time of danger and saved his life. After a moment of silence, he said, our family's business partner is Counselor Pabre. I believe that Shi Qinghai has already told you. Since that is the case, whether you ask for my help or not, I will do my best to prevent him from succeeding. Sulu raised his head, looked at him, and said, thank you. What do you plan to do from now on? Tai Ziyuan suddenly asked, continue to study at your university? No, although I haven't decided yet, I don't want to go back to your university. Sulu put his feet into the slightly hot white sand. After a moment of silence, he said, I met you in university, I met Shi Qinghai, and I met Zhang Xiaomeng. But now that you are leaving, Shi Qinghai has already left, and Xiaomeng has left completely. I think that it is time for me to leave as well. Tai Ziyuan's face didn't show any surprise. Su Li's choice had long been within his calculations. He looked at Su Lu and said, if you don't mind, I can arrange it for you. The Tai family was the most low-key of the 7 families in the Federation, but also the most unfathomable. If they wanted to arrange a person's future, that person's future would be incomparably bright and brilliant. If it were anyone else, they probably wouldn't refuse. However, Sula didn't even think about it. He directly smiled and said, thank you, but no need. This answer was also within Tai Ziyuan's expectations. He was more curious about what reason Sulu would use to refuse him. I saw a supervisor of the Blackhawk Security Company in that base. According to Shi Qinghai's analysis, he should be someone that the Tai family has had their eyes on for a long time. Sulu looked into Tai Ziyuan's eyes and said, you are destined to do great things in the future, so you have already started to train many capable assistants. If I accept your help, I will definitely become your subordinate in the future. Tai Ziyuan slightly frowned and looked at him. He said, a person living in this world must have his own goals and find the meaning of his existence. And to achieve those goals, you must obtain more resources and be able to enter a certain class faster. For you, there is no doubt that this is a better choice. The problem is, I don't know where my life goals are. Sula laughed self-deprecatingly and said, and what I don't like most about you is that from time to time, you show an attitude that can decide other people's lives. Tai Ziyuan touched his nose. His expression was not good, not only because of Su Li's words, but also because he found that Su Li's attitude of rejecting him was very firm. Don't refute me. That is a kind of pride that comes from the bones. Sulu lay on the beach chair, narrowed his eyes and looked at the waves. He said, I am a very quiet person, but in fact, I am a very proud person. I can talk to you like this now because I am your friend. If I was destined to be your subordinate in the future, it would be impossible for us to talk like this. If I followed in your footsteps, perhaps I could quickly become a top person in this society, but you should know that my life since I was young was not very happy. I don't have a good impression of the class you are talking about, or even the Federation. Don't say these words in front of me. After a long silence, Tai Ziyuan said, I have to remind you, don't be influenced by Shi Qinghai and Zhang Xiaoming's deaths and become a fanatic. I only become talkative in front of you guys, Su Le said. As for the anti-government forces, I think you are mistaken about something. I am just a very ordinary young man, but I am very lucky, or very unlucky, to meet you. Sometimes I also think whether meeting you is good luck or bad luck. Tai Ziyuan said with a smile, if it wasn't for you, the officers of the 2nd Military Region wouldn't have known that I would appear in the stadium. But if it wasn't for you, perhaps I would have died several times. Tai Ziyuan raised his hand and stopped Su Le from speaking. He said, but you are not an ordinary person, you just don't want to admit it, or you don't have this self-awareness. Su Le narrowed his eyes and looked at the setting sun. After hearing this sentence, his heart suddenly trembled a little. He knew that Tai Ziyuan could not know the secret of his body, but he still thought of the structure diagram in his mind, the fake chip behind his neck, and his back was a little stiff. The director of Blackhawk Security Company, Xue Nain. Tai Ziyuan looked back at the forest behind the beach. Under the light of dusk, the forest was gorgeous as if it was burning. He can't forget about you. Although there is no video of the battle in the underground parking lot, this former military special forces soldier insists that your past must be very complicated. And that national idol, if you are really a very ordinary person, how could she have gone to see you twice? Tai Ziyuan said with a smile, even earlier. Think about how we met. At this time, you must have guessed that the access to the H1 area is very high, but you were able to enter. There is one thing I haven't asked you. Tai Ziyuan looked at Su Le, who had a serious expression. After being rejected, his mood improved slightly. He asked very carefully, how did you meet Professor Jean? Professor Jean? Su Le was confused. However, Tai Ziyuan thought that he was playing dumb. He forced a smile and did not pursue the matter. Instead, he said, everyone has their own secrets. Since you are not willing to tell me, I won't ask anymore. Besides, I will help you keep this secret. I really don't know any Professor Jean. This kid is still pretending. Tai Ziyuan was somewhat gloomy and looked at him unhappily. Not long ago, the First Academy's laboratory had sent back a second report. In that report, it was pointed out that if the experimental data were not wrong, then the reaction speed of the person operating the mecha was much faster than the average person. Meanwhile, the First Academy's ace student, Zhou Yu, who had once sparred with Su Le in the mecha combat room, was the focus of the Tai family. During the other's first contact with the Tai family's subsidiary companies, he had also been asked this question. Zhou Yu had given the pilot who had operated the black prototype mecha very high praise. This outstanding student of the First Military Academy's mecha department had pointed out without hesitation that the pilot who had walked away with a belly full probably had not been in contact with mecha operation training for long, but his potential was unbelievably huge. He could even be called a true genius. Having eaten Su Le's countless midnight snacks in the H1 area, Tai Ziyuan naturally knew better than anyone else when Su Le had first started to interact with mecha. He also knew how astonishing the other's rate of improvement was, so he did not doubt this information at all. If he was just a genius mecha operator, perhaps Tai Ziyuan would not have paid so much attention to Su Le. His relationship with Su Le was not bad, but that was only a personal relationship. Once it involved official business, this successor of the Tai family would return to absolute calm. He just felt that this person Su Le still had many abilities, many secrets that had yet to be unearthed. Professor Jean had been missing for so many years, and yet he had thrown such a person back to Yue University. No one would believe that this person did not have any abilities. I don't want to force you. Tai Ziyuan looked at Su Le and said, if I tell mother that you are Professor Jin's student, I think that no matter how much you hate the so-called class I belong to, you will not be able to leave, because she will definitely fly over immediately. Su Lo was stunned. He did not understand why this matter would involve Tai Ziyuan's mother, the madam who truly controlled the Tai family, and why she would value that Professor Jean so much, but he really did not know who Professor Jean was, so he could only smile silently. He knew that Tai Ziyuan would definitely not speak carelessly, so this Professor Jean must really exist, and was somehow related to him. His mind began to work quickly, thinking endlessly. In Tai Ziyuan's eyes, this silence was seen as Su Li's tacit agreement and concession. He shook his head and sighed, "This world has always been unfair. Why must you be so stubborn?" At this moment, Su Li was still thinking about Professor Jean, the H1 area, and the access rights to the chip. The past scenes in his mind gradually linked together, allowing him to think of a certain possibility. His expression could not help but become serious. After being startled by Tai Ziyuan's words, he was silent for a moment, and then said, "You still don't believe me. I just don't want to be your subordinate, because my friends are very few now. What should I do next? I will enter a relatively large motor company, and I hope to get into the research and development department, so that I can work in a job that I like." Su Li looked at the horizon with a calm expression, watching the gradually setting sun and the bright red light that reflected in a straight line, and said, "Of course, if the Shell Motor Company can recruit me, who has no qualifications, then that would be even better." This was Su Li's dream since he was in the Donglin district. However, at this moment, Su Li was thinking more about the promise he had made to Zhang Xiaoming. He would enter a big company, earn a good salary, buy a house, and then, he would quietly watch the presidential election. He would see if there was such a thing as justice and morality in this world. That's it. Tai Ziyuan, who had been quietly listening to the side, suddenly laughed, then shook his head and said, "I wanted to do something for you, but now it seems that I can't do anything." Su Lo also laughed and said, "If a young master like you doesn't want to owe anyone a favor, then you can give me that black car." That day in the underground parking lot, I felt that car was extremely sturdy. I'm really curious about the structure inside. That's not a problem, Tai Ziyuan said. Then what is your dream? Your family background is too good, as if everything is prepared for you. Don't tell me you really want to be the president in the future? Su Lo turned his head and looked curiously at Tai Ziyuan's slightly thin cheeks. Tai Ziyuan's brows showed a faint trace of melancholy. He said, "Everyone has their own dream. When I was young, my dream was, time gradually passed, and the sun gradually set. The sky above the sea was suffused with an extremely deep blue-black, like a large piece of dark green jade." Just as the two young people with completely different statuses were talking about life and dreams, the endless stars began to flash in the night sky. Everyone's position is different, so their specific dreams are also different. I want to completely eliminate the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain. No matter what method I use, I must make these traitors unable to delay the Federation's advance. When his dream went from having a beautiful girlfriend, to having a playmate that he could play with in the mud, to this type of category, Tai Ziyuan's expression became serious. If it was another skinny young man who wasn't even 20 years old who said these words, it would only make the audience laugh until they collapsed on the beach. However, Su Li listened seriously and silently. It was because he knew that the young man beside him might really be able to accomplish these things in the future. The threat of the Empire must be eliminated. The social contradictions within the Federation must be alleviated, and we must obtain a chance for peaceful development. However, these are all not my dreams. These steps are only the prerequisites for me to realize my dreams. Tai Ziyuan raised his head to look at the sky. Looking at the countless stars in the sky, his face suddenly flashed with an extremely yearning expression. He slowly said, "Where exactly should the Federation go in the future? In this day and age where certain types of energy are gradually lacking, the entire Federation seems to have already been lifeless for many years. Why is it that our dreams, our vision, always stop at things like power and wealth? That is because the vast majority of people don't have power or wealth." Su Li didn't say these words out loud. It was because he could tell that Tai Ziyuan's words right now were all extremely sincere. He followed Tai Ziyuan's gaze and looked towards the sky. "Right now, apart from the occasional glimmer of light in the ocean, there wasn't a single trace of light around the beach. This made the curtain of stars in the night sky above seem even more clear. The Federation's future should lie in the starry sky. Tai Ziyuan stared at the curtain of stars for a long time, and then said with an extremely serious tone. In Heshi State University's library, Sulu had also read many books on cosmic astronomy. He narrowed his eyes and looked towards the sky. He couldn't help but say softly, the Federation has now explored 74 planetary systems. It is said that the Empire has 16 planetary systems. The nearby space has already been completely explored. If we continue to head into the Silver Core, it is not something that current space technology can support. Under the gravitational field, the human body will always appear too weak. If we don't head into the Silver Core, why head outside? The universe outside is still very, very big. If we say that the war between the Federation and the Empire is because of resources, then in such a big world, why do we have to fight to the death for a fly in the corner of a wall? A hint of mockery appeared at the corner of Tai Ziyuan's lips. And those politicians, families, merchants in the Federation. Even if their desires are bottomless, the universe is big enough to satisfy their ambitions. This is a beautiful idea, but naturally, it is also a very whimsical idea. After a moment of silence, Sulu said, if we want to reach other planetary systems, we have to pass through the dark canopy. With our current endurance, we could have done it a long time ago. The problem is that without the star map and the mark of the self-generated space door, none of the exploration spaceships in the early days of the constitutional era could return. On the beach, in the night sky, among the countless stars, there was an area that was strangely devoid of stars. That area was the periphery of the Milky Way where the Federation was located. If humans wanted to go beyond the Milky Way and enter the real outer space, that path was the best choice because no matter which direction they set off from, they would encounter the obstruction of countless stars. However, it was precisely because that area had no mark that it swallowed countless spaceships of the Federation for tens of thousands of years that it was called the Dark Canopy. Tai Ziyuan looked at the darkness and the stars above his head and said regretfully, it is said that in the past, there was once someone who really left this galaxy. There was once a star map in this world that led to the outer galactic world, but unfortunately, no one has ever found it. But, if someone before us was able to do it, why can't we do it? That must be a legend. Sulu shook his head and said, using a legend as a foundation for your ideals, you're not much better than me. Having said that, he still felt a trace of respect for Tai Ziyuan. Looking at the sky full of stars, he subconsciously stroked the bracelet on his wrist and thought of the words engraved on the bracelet. But it's an ideal after all. I don't want to be like most people in the Federation, sprinkling some salt on their ideals, drying them, and drinking them when they're old. Tai Ziyuan said. Sulu said with a smile, cured meat is indeed not as delicious as smoked meat. You spilled the beans again. Tai Ziyuan lowered his head and looked at him with a faint smile. He said, this is an old saying. Not many people in the Federation know what it means. In an era where you can only eat synthetic meat, no one will use salt, and no one will make smoked meat, unless they often eat wild meat. How can a person who often eats wild meat be an ordinary person? Chapter 149. The weather of early spring did not make the flowers in the streets of the capital special zone start to sway. The temperature of 30 degrees north latitude seemed to be still immersed in the memories of winter. There were only a few hurried pedestrians on the empty streets. The center of the Federation was as solemn and monotonous as usual. Like the magnificent buildings on both sides of the street, it was difficult to feel close to it. The special zone West 12th Street was far away from the major departments of the government. It was quieter. This street gathered a few of the biggest companies in the Federation, but it was not as prosperous as the ones in Harbor City. There were also no bizarre 3D images showing off in all directions. The appearance of these buildings was ordinary and peaceful. There was a sense of grandeur as if one had seen the end of human history. At the corner of the street facing Charter Square, there was a building with a faint metallic luster, but it did not form a strong reflection of the sun. People who knew this company knew that these walls were all made with the latest technology in the Federation. It was currently the most efficient light-absorbing material. Su Lu looked at the building in front of him that was close to zero light pollution. He narrowed his eyes and carefully counted the floors twice, confirming that it was the 47th floor. This boring action of counting floors was a way for him to calm his nerves. This was the first time in his life that he applied for, and the company he applied for was the most famous Shell Motor Company in the Federation. When Su Lu was an apprentice who repaired household appliances in the operation room of the mine, entering the Shell Motor Company in the Federation was his life dream. For the aspiring young people in the Federation, the name Shell Motor Company had always been covered with a layer of dizzying brilliance. The Shell Motor Company was the biggest motor company in the Federation, representing the level of the entire industry. The status of this motor company was forged by both history and reality. The Jingnong brand high-energy battery that changed the lives of countless people in the Federation was the most amazing invention of this motor company many years ago. The Shell Motor Company followed human society into the constitutional era. With the growth of the Federation, it had developed into a big company. The company's business was extremely broad and involved in many fields, including cars, multi-purpose ships, spaceships, spaceport mechanical equipment, ground transmission systems. This motor company had a very arrogant slogan: "As long as there is metal, there will be a symbol of a fruit shell." These words were not false. Although the Federation's files had never been declassified, everyone, including the Empire, knew that the Shell Motor Company was involved in the development of the continuous series of mecha from the Type B of the Federal military. The military's space battleships were naturally inseparable from this company. Such a giant corporation affected many aspects of the Federation, but no one could truly know who this company belonged to. However, it was different from other family companies that did not disclose their information. The Shell Motor Company had always been at the forefront of all companies in terms of information disclosure. If such a huge company still wanted to play mysterious, whether it was the politicians or the ordinary citizens of the Federation, they would not be able to accept it. The reason why no one knew who the owner of the Shell Motor Company was because the structure of the Shell Motor Company's shares was very complicated. Other than the 30% shares that were taken over by the Federation Citizen Fund during the First Constitutional Court, there were also countless public welfare funds and private funds. The Federation Citizen Fund, which held 30% of the shares, was exercised by the Federation Management Committee. Other than that, the second largest shareholder was the Veterans Association, also known as the Veterans Association. However, the Veterans Association only held 1.4% of the shares. From this, it could be seen that the structure of the Shell Motor Company's shares was so complicated that it made one's hair stand on end. The reason for this situation was determined by history. A large company that could affect the foundation of the Federation would definitely be controlled by the Federation. However, how could those profit-seeking financial giants and the big families behind the scenes let go of such a fat piece of meat? After countless years of fighting, everyone realized that no one had the ability to swallow this company alone, which led to the current situation. The Federal Military and the Academy of Science also had acting shares in the Shell Motor Company. After the Federation Statistics Department's last precise calculation in the 41st year of the Constitutional Court, if the Federation Citizen Fund and the shares with military background were included, the Federation could control 41% of the Shell Motor Company's shares. The Statistics Department and economists believed that under the strict supervision of the relevant laws, as many as 3,000 shareholders' insider trading was completely blocked. It was difficult to fundamentally change the complex ownership structure formed by history. Under this situation, even if the 7 big families of the Federation worked together, they would not be able to control the Shell Motor Company without alerting the Federation government. At this point, the Federation government was finally able to relax. Therefore, in name, the Shell Motor Company was a company that belonged to all the people of the Federation. The countless funds and private individuals that held scattered shares could only enjoy dividends and related rights. Before leaving the university town of Linhai, Su Lu had already submitted his electronic resume to a few well-known companies of the Federation through the internet. At the end of the resume, he attached his transcript as an auditing student at UA University. At the same time, he also attached a recommendation letter written by Professor Zhou. When he asked Professor Zhou for help in writing the recommendation letter, Professor Zhou did not hesitate at all. This was because after only 1 year of study, the professor could clearly determine that Su Lu had a very precious intuition and sensitivity in the field of mechanical engineering, as well as very strong practical operating skills. The only thing that puzzled Professor Zhou was that since Su Lu was the person that Professor Jean had chosen, why did he not directly ask Professor Jean to introduce him to those big companies? Although Professor Jean had left S1 for many years, with his reputation in the industry, his student should have the qualifications to choose any company he wanted. The electronic resume had Su Li's citizen number attached to it. After the resume was submitted to a few of the big companies of the Federation, it was classified as a file that did not belong to the privacy protection regulations. It could be directly accessed by the Human Resources Department of these companies. Su Lu was not worried that these companies would find anything unusual in his file. After all, the fake chip behind his neck was used to play hide and seek with the Bureau of Proclamation. It was impossible for there to be any problems in the file. However, Su Lu did not have the slightest bit of confidence in the prospects of applying for the job. No matter how outstanding his transcript was at Yale University, he was only an auditing student after all. He did not even have a diploma. His resume before he enrolled was also somewhat laughable. If it was said that a retired soldier with a military background in mechanical engineering would have some sort of advantage when applying for a job in these big companies, his file clearly recorded that he was only a mine maintenance soldier squatting in the Donglin district. However, he did not know whether it was because of Professor Zhou's recommendation letter or some other reason. Not long after the resume was sent out, Su Lu received an electronic interview invitation letter from 3 companies. Su Lu did not hesitate to choose the Shell Motor Company. Therefore, at this time, he appeared in the Special Capital District, in front of this building. Where there is metal, there is a shell. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the row of small words in front of the building, as well as the Shell logo that was deeply engraved into the metal wall at the end of the words. He took a deep breath. The slogan in front of the Shell Motor Company's headquarters was more concise and more powerful than the slogan circulating among the people of the Federation. It seemed to have some sort of magical power. He finally confirmed that there was nothing inappropriate about his clothes and walked into the building. Could it be that Tai Ziyuan guy helped me? Su Lu smiled bitterly. After the conversation on the beach, he had not seen Tai Ziyuan again. Although these 2 young people were indeed friends in a sense, after all, the social class gap was too large, so it was impossible for them to contact each other as often as normal friends. Regarding the Linhai State Gymnasium assassination, the Federation government's investigation had come to an end. Originally, whether it was Shi Qinghai or Zhang Xiaomeng, Su Lu would be noticed by the government and invited to tea by the Federation Investigation Bureau. However, because of Su Li's positive role in this incident and the strong suppression of the Tai family, Su Li's role in this incident had been sealed in a secret file. He successfully returned to the life of an ordinary person. Welcome to the Shell Motor Company. A sweet-looking female staff member at the front desk of the building confirmed Su Li's name and citizen ID number. She tapped on the light touch screen and said with a smile, "The interview will be held on the 32nd floor, Section C. I hope everything goes well for you." The service attitude was very good. It did not seem like a giant company owned by the Federation at all. Su Lu was slightly stunned. He suddenly felt that it was ridiculous. It was as if he had returned to the Star Clubhouse and was discussing the service content and price with the lady at the front desk. He blinked hard and smiled at the lady at the front desk with some embarrassment. After taking the high-speed elevator to Section C on the 32nd floor, Su Lu did not line up. He was directly taken to a room by the staff member. This was not a special privilege. The HR department of the Shell Motor Company was conducting a second test. All the applicants had to go through 2 rounds of screening before the actual recruitment test. The first round was to filter their resumes, and the second round was to conduct an interview in the room. The deputy director of the 7th department of the Shell Motor Company's HR department was a balding middle-aged man. He looked at Su Lu, who had pushed open the door and entered. He then looked at the information and introduction on the light screen. He could not help but frown slightly. He was very dissatisfied with the work of his colleagues in the HR department. Even though Yale University was the most powerful research institution in the three major systems other than the third university, how could an auditing student be qualified for the research work of the Shell Motor Company? Even though he had a professor's recommendation letter and his academic record was not bad, the balding middle-aged man looked at the leader beside him with a questioning gaze. Then, he turned to Sulu, who was sitting on the chair, and asked coldly, "I won't ask why you want to enter the Nutshell Mobility Company, and I don't want to express any opinions about your resume because that's not my job scope. I just want to ask you what you think about the name of our company. Why should our company be called the Shell Motor Company?" Chapter 150. The fruit shell is used to protect the delicate flesh of the fruit. And to humans, the function of a machine is like a layer of fruit shell. It protects the relatively fragile body of humans and allows them to survive in a harsh environment. I think the reason why the Shell Corporation named it Fruit Shell at the beginning was to tell every employee that the starting point and the ultimate goal of the research and development of the Shell Corporation was to satisfy the needs of humans. Machines, in the end, have to be based on humans. Sula naturally would not talk about how the human body was the most important machine during the interview, and that other things like mechas and battleships were just extensions. Perhaps this kind of argument was fresh, but fresh would definitely be unorthodox. He did not want to be treated like a fool by these chief examiners of the Human Resources Department. Hearing Su Li's answer, the bald, middle-aged examiner showed a slightly surprised smile on his face. It seemed that he was very satisfied with Su Li's understanding of the word fruit shell. Beside the bald chief examiner, the other chief examiner, whose eyes had been half closed all this time, slowly opened his eyes at this moment and looked seriously at Su Lu, who was sitting on the chair. "Not bad, you've passed the interview. Prepare for the real test later." The examiner looked at Su Lu thoughtfully and indicated that he could leave the room. Su Lu was stunned for a moment before he reacted. He did not expect that the so-called interview would end so quickly just by answering a simple question. After Su Lu left the room, the bald examiner respectfully said to the person beside him, "Director, what do you think of this candidate?" The examiner, who had been silent with his eyes closed, was the Human Resources Manager of the Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department, Jose. Originally, the recruitment exam in the spring should not have startled a high-ranking human resources manager like him. However, because the engineering department had reached a certain impasse during this period of time, they really needed some fresh blood. Therefore, he specially made a trip back to the Shell Motor Corporation headquarters to listen in on the recruitment. Manager Jose randomly chose a room as if he was gambling on his luck. He did not expect to meet Su Lu. The company's culture isn't a secret. If you put in the effort, you should be able to guess the meaning of the shell. In the past, when we were recruiting, the correct answer rate for this question was 4%. Jose expressionlessly opened the screen in front of him and began to examine Su Li's information file. He continued, "However, I am very satisfied with this candidate's answer. Machines should be people-oriented." This was the highest philosophy that the founder of the Shell Motor Company, as well as the countless researchers that came after him, had always carried forward. What a pity, Jose finished reading Su Li's file at the fastest speed possible. He could not help but pat his wrist lightly, and a look of pity appeared on his face. He sighed and said, "He was born in the army, and he only studied under old Zhou in Yue University for a year. Looks like this young man has no problems with his comprehension and diligence. It's a pity that he only studied for a year. The Federation's projects are as complicated as the stars. No matter how diligent he is, his basic knowledge is definitely not enough. No matter how strong his practical ability is, he is limited by his background and years of study. It is impossible for him to have satisfactory design potential." Although he said so, this person in the upper echelon of the Shell Motor Company did not immediately remove Su Lu from the list of candidates. There were no ready-made outstanding engineers in the Federation. Even if it was an outstanding student who graduated from the mechanical engineering department of the three major military academies, after entering the Shell Motor Company, He would need to undergo several years of training before he could truly become a talent. Although Jose did not have high hopes for Sulu, he vaguely thought that this retired soldier would be able to give him a surprise in the assessment later. Let's see how he performs first. As long as he can pass the baseline, keep him. After thinking for a while, Jose told the bald examiner beside him, if he doesn't pass, remember to leave his contact information. Then, persuade him to return to your university and study under the professors there for another 2 years. The company will wait for the day when he is truly outstanding. The bald examiner was slightly stunned, but he agreed. He could not help but sigh at the luck of the candidate called Sulu. Supervisor Jose, on the other hand, was only thinking that today's exam questions were personally set by those fellows from the engineering department. Out of the 100 or so applicants from various universities outside, perhaps only a dozen or so truly outstanding people would be able to pass the baseline, not to mention that young man who had only sat in for a year at your university. The selection of resumes was the first round, and the interview was the second round. All the confident graduates from the Federation had submitted tens of thousands of resumes to the Shell Motor Company. After these 2 rounds, there were only a little more than 100 candidates left. Sulu did not know about the recruitment process of the Shell Motor Company. He only felt that it was a little strange. Why did the interview end so quickly? In fact, this was because the person in charge of human resources from the engineering department was present in his room. Naturally, the decision was made faster. The examiners from the human resources department in the other rooms had done all the necessary procedures and made the candidates answer 17 questions consecutively. Walking out of the room, Sulu was led to the resting area by the staff. He waited alone in the empty resting area for the next round of the exam to begin. He waited for a long time, but no one else came. Only then did he realize that he was the only exception in this round of the interview. It ended faster than anyone else. There was no one around, and there was nothing to do. Sulu sat on the metal chair by the window. He picked up a copy of the Shell Motor Company's internal technical journal from the small table beside him and began to kill time. Who knew that he would be engrossed in reading it? Although these internal technical journals did not involve any particularly high-end confidential technology, the articles published by the engineers of the Shell Motor Company, whether it was the whimsical design ideas, the meticulous logical inference, or the detailed and rich experimental data, all of them made Sulu feel a sense of familiarity and aroused a strong interest in him. Once he was engrossed, he did not know how much time had passed. When he was awakened by the discussions around him, it was almost noon. The resting area was already filled with candidates who had passed the second round of interviews. Those who dared to confidently submit their resumes to the Shell Motor Company were mostly fresh graduates from the 3 major military academies. There were also a few students from the Capital University's Fine Arts Department. Although Linhai State's university town had the most universities in the entire Federation, the number of people who applied for the Shell Motor Company was the least. There was no doubt that the students who were able to pass the 2 rounds of the Shell Motor Company's screening were all outstanding young people. Outstanding young people often appeared to be more arrogant. A more appropriate way to express arrogance was silence. Furthermore, graduates from the 3 major military academies had basically received military-style education. They all had the demeanor of a soldier. Therefore, even though the resting area was filled with more than 100 people, it was still very quiet. The sounds of discussion were not too loud. After the candidates had all arrived, it was time for lunch. Sitting at the dining table of the Shell Motor Company's headquarters, the silence was gradually broken. Perhaps it was because the candidates found out that the Shell Motor Company's working lunch was so sumptuous. They were in a good mood and had more beautiful imaginations about their future prospects. Therefore, in groups of 3 to 5, they began to gossip and express their worries about the official examination in the afternoon. Sulu occasionally spoke a few words with the people at the same table. Most of the time, he was still silent. However, on his plain and simple face, there was always a friendly smile, so no one expressed dissatisfaction with his silence. Because the Shell Motor Company belonged to the military, if graduates from the three major military academies were able to enter the Shell Motor Company, it was equivalent to entering the military's research institute. They could still count their military service, which was another form of military service. These outstanding graduates who were determined to enter the Shell Motor Company were divided into three groups according to the three major military academies. Su Lo happened to be in the group of the first military academy. After listening to the gossip for a long time, he suddenly asked, "It seems like there are no graduates from the Westwoods Military Academy." For Su Lo, besides the ubiquitous the glory of the charter, what he was most worried about was the few soldiers who had seen his true face in the East Woods region. It was because of this worry that in the past year, he had never tried to call the number on the business card. Occasionally, he would think of Little Watermelon, but he had never contacted her. The Westwoods Military Academy was under the jurisdiction of the 4th Military Region. Su Lo was willing to see people from the 4th Military Region in the Shell Motor Company, but after confirming that there were no problems, he felt that it was a little strange. After graduating from the Westwoods Military Academy, most of the students will enter the Ancient Clock Company. After all, that company's headquarters is in the Westwoods region, said a serious-looking graduate from the 1st Military Academy. After saying thank you, Su Lo fell silent again. He quietly listened to the young people at the table exchange their experiences in school and interviews. At the same time, he guessed whether the formal assessment in the afternoon would be more focused on design or practice. "You look young. Which university did you graduate from?" a person beside him suddenly asked. "Yale University, but I didn't get a diploma. I was an auditing student," Su Lo replied. "Auditing student? How many years have you studied?" "More than a year." As soon as he said this, the whole table fell silent. It was not unusual for a graduate from Yale University to enter the Shell Motor Company, but how could an auditing student who had only studied for a little more than a year be so thick-skinned as to participate in the recruitment of Nutshell? The graduate from the 1st Military Academy frowned and glanced at Su Lo. He was very puzzled as to how Su Lo had passed the first two rounds of the assessment. Today, this cafeteria was specially opened for the examinees. The sound of discussion gradually filled the cafeteria. An auditing student from Yale University had entered the final round of the examination. This fact made all the examinees feel that it was inconceivable. Apart from that, the outstanding graduates of the three major military academies felt a trace of shame. Yes, it was a humiliation. No one would humiliate Su Lo in front of his face, but the silence and cold gazes had already expressed their disdain and contempt. Su Lo seemed to be unaware of it. He smiled slightly and didn't care at all. He left the table and walked towards the door. At the door, another young man who had just left the table happened to walk side by side with Su Lo. That young man looked at Su Lo thoughtfully and asked, "May I ask, what were you doing before you entered Yale University?" "After I left the army, I went to Linhai." Mechanic Officer Wei Pei-sheng. "No, I was a squatting soldier." Su Lo replied with a smile, but his feelings were somewhat complicated. This was because he recognized this young man beside him. He knew that this young man was the most outstanding student from the 1st Military Academy. However, he didn't understand why this young man didn't join the army directly, but instead came to Nutshell to apply. "My name is Zhou Yu. I have a feeling that this afternoon's assessment shouldn't be a big problem for you." That young man smiled and extended his hand towards Su Lo. Su Lo shook his hand. He really wanted to tell the other that he knew him, and that they had once had a fierce fight in the mecha combat room. Chapter 151. Scammer. What do you think is wrong with this world? We worked so hard under the whip of the demonic instructor for 4.5 years, while others only need to serve 1.5 years of military service, then attend some bullshit university for another 1.5 years, and then sit in for the exam with us. He's probably good at fixing electrical appliances. Even the 37 cross-sectional diagrams of a mecha's central chip could turn that kid into an idiot. Zhou Yu quietly looked at Su Li's back as he disappeared into the corridor. His expression did not change at all when he heard the discussions and disdainful comments around him. 5 years of life in the military academy had given this outstanding military cadet excellent self-discipline and self-control, which was why he could be so calm. In preparation for the invasion of the empire, the Ministry of National Defense had started implementing a comprehensive talent plan a few years ago. The outstanding graduates of the 3 major military academies would undergo training and work in various large mobile companies before they officially entered the military. Zhou Yu, who should have started as a junior officer in the military, was also part of this comprehensive talent plan. The Shell Motor Company, which had a strong military background, was naturally the first choice for this plan. However, the board of directors of the Shell Motor Company was still an independent existence from the government, so the implementation of this comprehensive talent plan was not based on the will of the officials of the Ministry of National Defense. The graduates of the 3 major military academies still had to go through the Shell Motor Company's independent assessment. Zhou Yu was the trump card of the first military academy, and had an extremely high prestige among his classmates. When he left the dining table, the graduates of the first military academy put down their plates at the same time and followed his footsteps, thus overhearing his conversation with Su Le. "Don't bother with that idiot. Zhou Yu, during the assessment in the afternoon, you have to give your brother a hand. Piloting a mecha is not a problem, and memorizing the circuit diagrams is fine too. If you really want to do some empty design, I don't have the brains." Hearing the word idiot, Zhou Yu turned around and stared coldly at Anda beside him. This brainless first military academy student was his good friend, but at this moment, Zhou Yu could only think of the trip to Yue University half a year ago. Anda had piloted a blue and black mecha and had been beaten into an idiot by a certain black M-type mecha. When the first military academy had visited Yue University, Zhou Yu had once had a simple conversation with the pilot of that mysterious black mecha in the mecha combat room. He had always remembered the way he had operated that black mecha. He also remembered that person's voice very clearly. Therefore, when Su Li's voice rang out in the cafeteria earlier, Zhou Yu keenly noticed this and specially left the table early to say a few words to Su Li. After a few words, Zhou Yu confirmed a fact. This auditing student from Yue University was the operator of the black mecha. "If I were you, I wouldn't be too arrogant in front of that Su Li guy. Otherwise, you'll have to dig a hole and hide in it in the future." Zhou Yu stared into Anda's eyes and said, "Don't say I didn't warn you. During your internship, you also went to the basement of the Shell Motor Company. You know that it's all alloy down there. I'm just worried that you won't be able to dig it up." As soon as this was said, the students surrounding Zhou Yu couldn't help but burst into an uproar. They didn't understand why Zhou Yu would have such a high opinion of that person, and they couldn't believe it in their hearts. Zhou Yu looked at the expressions of the surrounding students and said with a half-smile, "If you guys don't believe me, we can make a bet. In this afternoon's assessment, he will definitely pass the baseline." For an auditing student from a private university to be able to operate a prototype mecha and fight him to a draw, what kind of understanding of mecha did this require? Zhou Yu thought the baseline of 60 points seemed to be really difficult. Su Le narrowed his eyes and looked at the questions on the holographic screen in front of him. His fingers subconsciously drew together and turned slightly, as if he was transferring a primitive cross-shaped tool knife. Every time he was in some kind of difficult situation, he would always do this subconscious action. There weren't many questions on the holographic screen, only 3 pages in total. Su Le started from the first question, and by the time he reached the 4th question, he had already started to feel the difficulty. Just as the HR manager of the Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department had predicted, Su Le, who had only been an auditing student at Yue University for a year and had memorized all the previous M37 series mecha blueprints in Section H of the library, had never received a proper academy education, so he was very unfamiliar with these systematic knowledge questions. The Shell Motor Corporation was a company with a strong military background. Although all the professors of the mobility department acknowledged that the design, manufacturing, and repair of mecha covered most of the fields of machine construction in the entire Federation society, the scope of the recruitment exam couldn't be entirely limited to questions related to mecha. The scope of the subjects covered was very broad. Su Le memorized those formulas very well, and those parameters were also deeply engraved in his mind, impossible to forget. The problem was that Yue University was a private university after all. There was a lot of high-level information from the Federation that he had never come into contact with. Especially subjects like fluid dynamics and second-order physics, which were rarely used by private mobile equipment, were even more blank in his mind. The Federation's educational resources were already moving in the direction of fairness as much as possible, but due to the difference between a private university and a military academy, there was a lot of information that could only be accessed by the three major military academies. Take mecha blueprints, for example. A typical private university definitely wouldn't have them. Section H of Yue University's library had all the previous M37 series blueprints. This was already very impressive, but what about after the M37 series? The working principle of the rear-wheel auxiliary steering system can't be used in which type of self-propelled equipment. How much of a loss of balance will the servo motor installed 12 centimeters outside the beam cause? Under the environment of deep-sea volcanic rock at a depth of 13,000 meters, what material should be used to achieve the highest cost-performance ratio for the pressure-resistant cabin? XWD platform. Under the illumination of level 10 units of light, the trend of the electron transition of the crystal ore is as follows. The questions on the first 2 pages already covered more than 10 research directions related to engineering. Although they were all objective questions, to answer these questions, one had to grasp first-hand information and systematic analysis. These were the things that Su Le currently lacked the most. His finger lightly tapped on the holographic screen, but his eyebrows were furrowed even tighter. Although it was a little strenuous, Su Le didn't feel the slightest sense of defeat. This was a possible situation that he had already thought of before he applied for the job. Uncle Feng Yu and Professor Zhou both thought that he was a genius in mechanical engineering, but mechanical engineering was faced with material objects and leaned more towards practice. On the other hand, the Shell Motor Company's recruitment of R&D personnel leaned more towards theory, and his theoretical knowledge couldn't possibly be more complete than those outstanding officers of the 3 academies. The 20 objective questions were finally finished. Su Le gently exhaled and wiped the sweat on his forehead. Some of the questions, especially those related to material science, were basically not difficult for him. In the operation room of the Donglin district's mine pit, in order to repair those ordinary household appliances, Uncle Feng Yu had obtained so many materials from God knows where. After years of nurturing, Su Le now had a natural sense of touch when it came to materials. However, some of the questions really gave him a headache. After calculating the questions on the first 2 pages, Su Le found that he could only guarantee that he could answer 2/3 of the questions correctly. He silently calculated for a moment. If the next holographic screen question was still of this difficulty, then he would just barely pass the baseline. Su Le slightly relaxed. His finger lightly tapped on the holographic screen, and the last question of the Shell Motor Company recruitment exam appeared in front of his eyes. It was indeed the last question, because the holographic screen on the last page was completely clean. There was only one question and one blueprint. Su Le was slightly taken aback, and a trace of nervousness flashed through his eyes. This was because what he was most worried about now were the subjective questions. There was only one question on the last page, and it actually took up 40 minutes. It was clearly a difficult question. If this question involved the design and deduction of some modern military mecha, how could he have found a feasible direction in such a short amount of time? Narrowing his eyes, he stared unblinkingly at the blueprint on the holographic screen. The nervousness in Su Le's eyes disappeared, replaced by vigilance and a strong sense of unease. His face also gradually paled, because he had discovered something that made him very uneasy. This blueprint looked somewhat familiar. This was not the blueprint question on the blank piece of paper Jian Shuier had left in the hospital, but there seemed to be some vague similarities. For the past few days, Su Le had been troubled by the abnormal electrical discharge in his cerebral cortex and the bizarre and variegated images that would appear in his eyes from time to time. Now that he saw the familiar blueprint, his thoughts involuntarily returned to that annoying night. This blueprint should be a blueprint for the power transmission of some kind of large-scale equipment. However, it was different from the blueprint that Jian Shuier had forgotten in the hospital. It was not a power source, but a more powerful instantaneous energy output device. The question required the examinee to find a few mistakes in the blueprint and make changes based on their own understanding to ensure that the instantaneous energy output of the device was stabilized within a certain power range. Su Le had no idea what this device was. He could only guess the nature of this device based on the data given in the question. He studied it seriously for a long time, and vaguely grasped some sort of clue. The key to this question should be at the bottom left of the blueprint, where the control of the maximum lateral G value of the electron jet was. However, the problem was, although he knew how the electron jet worked, he had never seen the actual thing, not even a three-dimensional analysis diagram. He silently stared at the blueprint on the holographic screen. His face became paler and paler, and a drop of cold sweat began to seep out of his forehead. In the recruitment exam meeting room, there was a sense of disappointment. It seemed that the outstanding students of the third college did not have much confidence in such a complicated question. Some students even consciously began to leave the exam hall. Su Le continued to stare at the holographic screen in silence. His fingers gently rubbed together, and his eyes gradually narrowed. The students who gradually left the exam hall, as well as the staff of the motor vehicle company, gradually noticed the pale-faced young man at the back. In a mythical story about the time before the catastrophe, there was once a powerful person who said, "I want light," so there was light in this universe. The silent Su Le stared at the blueprint on the holographic screen and silently said in his heart, "I want the three-dimensional analysis diagram of the electron jet." Chapter 152. Gradually, more and more examinees left the conference room. These youngsters politely maintained their silence outside the room. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, they watched their peers in front of them. However, when they saw the slightly pale, motionless youth at the back, some of their eyes flashed with amusement and mockery. For the last major question, these examinees could only try to answer it tentatively based on the little understanding they had in class. They were all very outstanding students. They knew that even if they sat in front of the light screen for a few more hours, they would not suddenly be enlightened. Thus, they could only leave the conference room. However, that audit student who had been a squatter was actually still sitting in front of the light screen, motionless. At this time, there were not many students who were still in the conference room seriously thinking about the last blueprint. They were all people like Zhou Yu. Su Le, whose face was slightly pale, stared silently and strenuously at the light screen. When this scene fell into the eyes of the students from the three military academies, they naturally did not think that Su Le was seriously thinking about how to solve the problem like Zhou Yu and the others. Su Le did not move. His face was slightly pale, and beads of sweat could even be seen on his forehead. The examinees outside the conference room naturally thought that this guy definitely did not understand the question, but stubbornly refused to leave. He was afraid of losing face and was currently caught in a dilemma. Some people sympathized with this pitiful squatter, but even more people looked at Su Le in the corner with a mocking and contemptuous gaze. In their opinion, since he didn't have this kind of standard, he shouldn't have come here to make a fool of himself. Su Le, who had been silent for a long time, finally moved. He raised his finger and enlarged the blueprint on the light screen to its maximum. Then, he moved it to a complex structure on the lower right side. Then, he fell silent again. He narrowed his eyes and stared there without blinking. It was impossible for anyone to notice that in the air before his eyes, the pictures caused by the abnormal discharges in the cerebral cortex were flashing non-stop. The three-dimensional analysis of the electron jets was flashing non-stop like a slideshow, and it was being compared with the drawings on the light screen that had been magnified to the maximum. With the ready-made blueprint as a reference, Su Le's train of thought became much clearer. To solve the control of the maximum lateral G value of the electron jet, the key was the string of chip connections that could affect the acceleration curve of the SD direct injection. His train of thought had been confirmed, but Su Le still did not start to solve the problem. Instead, he quickly began to perform those virtual calculations in his mind. This was an extremely vague, even intuitive calculation because it was very unfortunate that the Shell Motor Company's assessment gave too little time, and there was no large-scale computer as a tool. It was impossible to complete the massive amount of calculations needed to complete the actual design. Therefore, Su Lu could only follow this train of thought and come up with a solution. He squinted his eyes and looked at the two blueprints in front of him and began to look for a place to start. The problem was that this unknown large-scale device was already an extremely complete closed system. If he wanted to modify the chip connections of the electron jet, it would inevitably affect the rest of the system. In other words, if he solved the problem according to Su Li's train of thought, then he would not only face the problem of modifying the electron jet, but also the entire structure diagram. Modifying the structure of a complete system required countless workers, a lot of time, and countless experiments to complete. Even if it was only a conceptual design change, it still required a lot of work. The most important thing was that for these candidates, they had already been taught a certain way of thinking by academic education. No one would have thought that a recruitment exam question would require candidates to use such a crazy way of thinking to solve it. Su Lu did not have this kind of fixed way of thinking. For mechanical and electronic systems, he still maintained the idea of repairing electrical appliances. After following Uncle Feng Yu for so many years, this idea had long been deeply ingrained in his mind. In his opinion, no matter how high-level a system was, it was actually not much different from the simple chip sets on electrical appliances. At most, it was just a little more complicated. This kind of crazy idea made Su Li's way of thinking different from others. He did not know that this structure diagram was the activation device of a certain type of battleship in the Federation. Even if he knew, the idea in his mind would not have the slightest hesitation. Uncle had said before that only the human body was the first-order machine. The rest were all boring combinations of metal and wires. There was no essential difference. The structure diagram that was enlarged to the maximum on the holographic screen had long been moved from the position of the electron jet to another position. In Su Li's mind, or rather in front of his eyes, the blueprints flashed like a slideshow. He did not know how many of them had been changed. Moving one part would affect the overall situation. Fortunately, the blueprints in his field of vision were like a database. Following his strong will, an unlimited number of structural models were constantly moved and compared with the structure diagram on the holographic screen. Su Lu became more and more familiar with this process. He faintly thought that he should have some kind of terrifying ability. His heart was excited, but his face was still calm. His face was slightly pale, and he narrowed his eyes as he stared at the holographic screen in front of him. The time for the examination to end was not yet up. Most of the examinees had already left the conference room. Although some of them had calculated that the problem in the last question should be with the electron jet, no matter how they calculated, they found that they could not change that part of the design without destroying the precision of the entire system. Therefore, they began to think that they had gone in the wrong direction. For this kind of large-scale equipment system, if a new design was to be made, it was not something that could be done by a single department. Naturally, it could not be the main point of the examination. Therefore, the last examinees to leave the conference room turned their thoughts to the rest of the structure diagram. A few of them successfully caught some problems and made the corresponding changes. Although they still could not meet the requirements of the examination, it was already very difficult. Zhou Yu was the second last examinee to leave the conference room. He frowned slightly, clearly dissatisfied with the changes he had made to the last structure diagram. However, he knew that he had done the best he could. Walking out of the conference room, he came to Enda's side. Following Enda's mocking gaze, Zhou Yu looked into the conference room and saw the slightly pale Su Lu. He could not help but ask in confusion, "He still hasn't come out?" The objective questions can be guessed, but I'm afraid he can't even understand the last question. Enda lowered his voice and sneered. "We came out early and kept seeing that guy staring at the holographic screen in a daze like a fool." His face was so scared that it turned white. Zhou Yu frowned. He kept feeling that things should not be like this. He had a confidence in that guy called Su Lu, that even he himself did not understand. That in the office beside the conference room, the supervisor of Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department, Jose, who had just interviewed Su Lu in the morning, carefully looked at the answers of the examinees sent over on the holographic screen. In the end, his gaze fell on Su Li's answer. He could not help but say regretfully, "It seems that this young man's basic knowledge is much better than I thought." He could pass the baseline at the beginning, but the last question was really too difficult for him. He could not have seen this kind of system structure before. It was almost time to hand in the exam. On Su Guang's exam paper, the last holographic screen was still blank. Supervisor Jose could not help but shake his head. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed. He stared at the words and lines on the holographic screen and refused to look away. After a while, Jose's face was slightly red. He pointed at Su Li's answer on the holographic screen and kept tapping his finger. The examiner beside him saw his expression and could not help but worry. He asked, "What's wrong?" "Talent. Talent." Jose took a deep breath and looked at the holographic screen with a face full of smiles. He said, "The engineering department wants this person." The examiners around him curiously looked at the answers on their own holographic screens. After looking at it for a while, their expressions became extremely interesting. They did not expect that the auditing student who came from a squatting soldier background could actually write such an answer. They were very clear that the last question was a problem that the monster engineers from the engineering department had just solved 3 months ago. Because it involved military secrets of the Federation, these students had to sign a confidentiality agreement beforehand. In this recruitment exam, the Shell Motor Corporation did not expect these freshly graduated students to be able to solve this question. They only wanted to test the thinking of the candidates. And in front of them, this young man named Su Lu, although he could not solve this problem, the slightly rough changes to the blueprints and the notes at the bottom were all faintly moving in the right direction. This examinee seems to be very familiar with the main cannon-based system. It's really incredible. The bald examiner hesitantly said, but there is still a big problem with the changes to the blueprints in the third region. What's there to be afraid of? Jose stared fixedly at the holographic screen and said loudly, "The key is this kid's thinking. It's really rare to see such a daring fellow nowadays." Su Lu sighed, put down the holographic marker pen in his hand, and walked out of the meeting room. As the end of the exam approached, he finally wrote down the design changes that he had compared and tested many times in his mind onto the holographic screen. The problem was that he still found many problems. Most importantly, in this short period of time, he could only make some vague changes to the concept, but he was still thousands of miles away from the requirements of the question. "How do you feel about the last question?" Outside the meeting room, Zhou looked at him and asked with a smile. Previously, when he saw Su Lu start writing at the end, he had already vaguely guessed something. "It's too difficult, I can't finish it at all." Although Su Lu did not know that the other had already recognized him, from the start of the mecha battle, he had a good impression of this first Academy's ace student. He answered honestly, "This kind of design change to a major system is not something I can handle. Even without the need for experimental data, just the design change alone will take at least a few months." Chapter 153. If you shut your mouth, no one here will treat you as a mute. Zhou Yu looked at Anda and uttered a famous Federation proverb. His calm gaze startled Anda. He scratched his head and obediently shut his mouth. "Since you are a student of your university, you must be studying under Professor Zhou," said Zhou Yu as he turned around and smiled at Su Lu. For some reason, Su Lu felt that the other party's gaze on him was a little strange. He had always thought that his face was very ordinary, but who would have thought that the other party would be able to recognize him just from his voice? After a few words, although Su Lu was not familiar with this ace student of the First Military Academy, he had gained a deeper understanding of him. He thought to himself that this person was able to obtain such respect and status among so many proud military students of First Military Academy. It seemed that it was not only because of his excellence, but also because of the aura he exuded through his speech and actions. At this time, all the examinees had already entered the meeting room. They were either nervous or calm as they waited for the final assessment results. Just like in the cafeteria, the 100 or so examinees were still divided into 3 groups according to the 3 major military academies. And because Su Lu was talking to Zhou Yu, he just happened to be sitting in the middle of this group of students from First Military Academy. The blonde examinee sitting in the first row is Park Ji-ho from the 3rd Military Academy. I heard that he flew over from District S3 a month in advance for the Shell Motor Company's spring recruitment. I wonder how he did today. Under the strange gazes of the surrounding students, Zhou calmly introduced the examinee to Su Lo. He was indeed very interested in Su Lo. On one hand, it was because he had guessed that the other was that fellow with the strange mecha piloting ability. On the other hand, before he had left the school, the staff of the Shou Shu Foundation who had sponsored his studies for 4.5 years had once asked him about the abilities of the black mecha operator from Yue University. In other words, Zhou Yu now knew that this auditing student who had once been a trooper had long since entered the sights of the Tai family management. He really wanted to try and get in touch with this kind of person. Park Ji-ho. Su Lo naturally did not know what Zhou Yu was thinking, so he replied casually. He's the ace student of the mechanical department of the 3rd campus. Last year, during the Tri-College Exchange Conference, he once fought against me in the mecha combat room. In the end, the professors determined that it was a draw. When the topic of mecha combat was brought up, Zhou Yu looked at Su Lo with a hint of a smile in his eyes. Su Lo was slightly surprised, and his gaze turned towards the golden-haired candidate in the front row. Although he had not had much interest in mecha combat, his training in Area H1 had made him no stranger to mecha combat. In that mecha battle, he had fought to a draw with Zhou Yu beside him, but he knew very well that if not for that antique simulation system, if not for the mysterious power within his body, and if not for his excellent luck at that moment, he definitely would not have been able to hold on under the ferocious attacks of Zhou Yu's silver mecha. For that Park Ji-ho to be able to fight to a draw with Zhou Yu, he must also be quite a powerful character. Park Ji-ho is proud and arrogant, and is completely unwilling to admit that it was a draw. This morning, he already made an appointment with me. After entering the company, we will have a real mecha battle on the testing grounds. Zhou Yu looked at Su Lo and asked seriously, "Are you interested?" Hearing the first half of the sentence, Su Lo sighed internally. These outstanding students of the 3 major military academies were indeed full of confidence and pride. It looked like they had never considered that they would fail the assessment. However, when he heard the last sentence, his heart could not help but tighten. He narrowed his eyes at Zhou Yu, and after a long pause, he smiled and said, "I have never even seen a real mecha in my life." Zhou Yu saw that Ling Lan was unwilling to respond to his probing, but he was not in a hurry. After a moment of silence, he asked directly, "The last time I went to Yue University, there was a black mecha." The smile on Su Li's face did not change, but his heart was growing more and more nervous. He did not know how the other party had connected him to that black mecha. Although he had already confirmed that the mysterious trembling power within his body could be perfectly concealed, and that even if someone found out that he was the pilot in that black mecha, there would not be any major problems, he still subconsciously felt somewhat uneasy. Fortunately, Zhou Yu's calm and questioning gaze did not put too much pressure on him and force him to admit anything. Because at that moment, a row of 7 examiners walked into the meeting room. The meeting room instantly fell silent. Su Lo let out a silent sigh of relief and shifted his gaze away. He noticed that the golden-haired examinee in the first row had finally raised his head at that moment. Right after that, he noticed that this row of examiners was surrounding a middle-aged man in the middle, and that middle-aged man looked somewhat familiar. It was the examiner Su Lo had interviewed within the morning. He narrowed his eyes slightly at the middle-aged examiner, and could not help but feel a little surprised. It looked like the other party's status in the Shell Motor Company was not low. The human resources manager of the Shell Motor Company engineering department, Jose, used a cold gaze to sweep across the faces of the examinees in the meeting room. Unlike his gaze, his mood was actually quite good. The results of this spring recruitment exam had greatly exceeded his expectations. It looked like the all-rounder plan of the Ministry of National Defense was indeed not bad. The most outstanding graduates of the 3 major military academies had indeed performed much better than the previous examinees. Of course, the one who made him even more satisfied and gave him endless surprises was still the examinee he had personally interviewed. Among the 7 examiners, Jose's rank was, of course, the highest. However, he was still the human resources manager of the engineering department, and this recruitment exam was the responsibility of the head office's Human Resources Department. Therefore, the matter of announcing the results and arranging the research direction of the examinees who passed the exam was left to the other examiners. The recruitment of the Shell Motor Company was fundamentally different from the recruitment of other companies. However, the examinees who passed the recruitment exam would be directly assigned to different departments, and there was no collective training for new employees. On one hand, this was because the examinees recruited by the most famous company in the Federation were the most outstanding group of people, and they had to satisfy the company's requirements of being able to use them. On the other hand, the company had always believed that the training of new employees should be carried out in practice, and should not waste any time and money. Following the voice of the examiner with a serious expression, examinees left the meeting room dejectedly from time to time. These were all people who did not pass the exam. As for the examinees who passed the exam, they listened attentively to the department they would be assigned to. Although being able to enter the Shell Motor Company was already a very difficult matter, being assigned to the best and most important department was, of course, an even better thing. The examinees who did not know the results of the exam were extremely nervous as they waited. Among them, there were naturally some who were different. For example, the blonde examinee in the first row, Park Ji-ho, or the smiling Zhou Yu, or Su Lo. He was very clear that although he did not finish the last big question, he should have just passed the basic score. He only secretly wished in his heart that it would be best if he could enter the engineering department. This was because, within the Shell Motor Company, other than the Research Institute, the engineering department had the most access to the most advanced technology. A large part of the reason he wanted to enter the Shell Motor Company was because he wanted to get close to that information. Supervisor Jose glanced at his wristwatch and realized that the flight back to Hong Kong was getting closer. He gently patted the shoulder of the examiner in front of him and said a few words with a smile. Then, he stood in front of everyone. He stared at the examinees who were still sitting in the audience and said, "I am the Human Resources Supervisor of the Engineering Department, Jose." Hearing this sentence, there was a sudden commotion in the audience. These students from the three major military academies were very clear about the position of the engineering department in the Shell Motor Company. Other than the Research Institute, the engineering department should be the most advanced department. Originally, they did not expect to be able to enter the engineering department, but they did not expect that the Human Resources Supervisor of the engineering department would be present in today's recruitment exam. What did this mean? I don't have much time, so I only have a few words to say. In today's recruitment exam, you all did very poorly. Only 7 people were able to pass the basic score. For those who passed the exam before, don't show the arrogance on your faces like you did in school. You all did not pass the basic score. The 7 examinees who passed the basic score, not bad. On behalf of the engineering department, I welcome all of you. The examinees in the meeting room were originally a little embarrassed, but after hearing this sentence, they could not help but become restless. They finally confirmed that the supervisor of the engineering department had personally come to the recruitment exam site to recruit people. All of the examinees wanted to enter the engineering department, so they all pricked up their ears, hoping that their names would come out from the supervisor's mouth. Even the examinees who had already been assigned to different departments were curiously watching. They did not know which lucky ones, or perhaps the most outstanding ones, would be chosen by the Shell Motor Company. The atmosphere in the meeting room was a little tense. Park Ji-ho, Zhou Yu. After reading out the 6 names, Jose subconsciously paused for a moment. Zhou Yu, whose name was called out, smiled. The blonde examinee in the first row relaxed his body, but frowned. It was obvious that he was not satisfied with Zhou Yu's name being called out after his. The examinees in the meeting room were both surprised and not surprised to hear these 2 names. This was because the students from the 3 academies often interacted with each other. They were very clear that in this batch of students, Park Ji-ho from the 3 academies and Zhou Yu from the 1 academy were the most outstanding. They were curious about who the 7th name was. Could it be that his results were better than Park Ji-ho's and Zhou Yu's? But they heard that there were no outstanding people in this batch of students from the 2 academies. Jose smiled as he looked at the circle of people from the 1 academy. He said, Su Lo. Once these words were said, the crowd was in an uproar. The students from the two academies in the front row could not help but stand up and turn to look at the circle of people from the first military academy. They wanted to see who this unfamiliar name was in the first academy. However, when they found out that the examinee chosen by the engineering department was actually the one they had previously mocked. Squatting soldier, everyone's expressions became extremely interesting. The only one who was mentally prepared, Zhou Yu, could not help but be surprised. He smiled and patted Su Li's shoulder. Everyone in the circle of people from the one academy was already stunned, especially the boorish Anda. At this moment, his mouth was wide open, and he looked at Su Lu as if he was looking at a monster. He was speechless for a long time. Chapter 154. When the white-haired old man walked into the meeting room, dozens of examinees were still immersed in the shock of hearing Su Li's name. When they suddenly heard such a loud voice, everyone curiously looked over. They did not know why this old man who suddenly appeared in the Shell Motor Company's meeting room would shout out Su Li's name. Some of the examinees even started to wonder if Su Lu had cheated during the exam and was found out by the company. That's right, if he did not cheat, how could this auditing student pass the exam? His performance was even more outstanding than the best students in the third campus, and he was chosen by the human resources manager of the engineering department. Some of them even started to fantasize. If Su Lu was stripped of his qualifications and kicked out of the meeting room, would it be their turn to be on the list of 7 people? Seeing the white-haired old man who directly rushed into the meeting room, the examiners on the stage respectfully greeted him. Only the human resources manager of the engineering department, Mr. Jose, frowned and did not say a word. He glared fiercely at the bald examiner beside him. The bald examiner frowned and said, "Mr. Jose, the research institute has been short of manpower recently. Especially this person, he has been cursing in the human resources department for the past 2 days. It's not that I deliberately revealed it, but he must have seen the results of the exam." At this time, an examiner introduced him to the examinees in the meeting room. "This is Professor Shen from our company's research institute." Hearing the words research institute, the examinees in the meeting room were dumbfounded. If the engineering department was the most advanced department in terms of technology in the Shell Motor Company, then the research institute was the cornerstone of the entire Shell Motor Company. For countless years, the research institute had provided the Shell Motor Company and the Federation with an endless supply of wisdom and research results. However, this high and mighty research institute had always signed cooperation agreements with professors from various universities. They had never heard of recruitment through the human resources department. Why did this old professor suddenly appear in the meeting room? Who is Su Lu? Professor Shen from the research institute did not pay attention to the examiner's introduction. He also did not pay attention to Mr. Jose's gaze. He shouted at the examinees below the stage. Su Lu was confused. He stood up and raised his hand. "I am." Professor Shen looked at him, then looked at the printed test paper in his hand. He nodded with satisfaction and said, "Although your basic knowledge is a bit lacking, you can barely use it. You, come with me." This scammer called Su Lu was not only chosen by the engineering department, but he was also about to be recruited as a staff member of the research institute. This fact made the atmosphere in the conference room even more strange. Besides Su Lu, Zhou Yu revealed a look of shock. Su Lu opened his mouth slightly, not understanding what had happened. The gazes of the examinees in the meeting room all landed on him. Envy, jealousy, shock, suspicion, and all sorts of emotions were present. Park Ji-ho, who was sitting in the first row, was also staring at Su Lu. His slender eyes, which were partially covered by his golden hair, were filled with disbelief and jealousy. Professor Shen, who came from the research institute, said to the examiner from the human resources department, "Help him with the procedures." At this moment, Mr. Jose, who had been silent, finally could not help but say, "Wait. This examinee has already been chosen by the engineering department." Professor Shen looked at him and frowned. He said, "I need manpower for my research project. The few thousand engineers in your engineering department are not enough for you?" The engineering department is not the Bureau of Proclamations Human Resources Committee. We don't have extra people. Mr. Jose did not budge. The research institute wants people and the engineering department wants them. Do you want me to go to the board of directors? This was only a small matter. Of course, it was not enough to alarm the Shell Motor Company's board of directors. However, Professor Shen was very confident in his words. After all, the research institute's position in the company was unshakable. The key is the examinee's own will. The board of directors cannot go against the wishes of the staff and arbitrarily transfer them. Mr. Jose said coldly. He then turned his head and said to Sulu, "Don't be scared by the reputation of the research institute. Young people like you will want to transfer out in 3 days if you go to that kind of lifeless place. Also, I have seen Professor Zhou's recommendation letter. Your hands-on ability is the strongest. The engineering department is the most suitable department for you." At this moment, the people in the meeting room were dumbfounded. Especially the examiners on the stage, they could not help but smile bitterly. Who would have thought that this year's spring recruitment would actually alarm the two major departments in the company? The most important thing was that these two departments were actually fighting over a single examinee. What was the most expensive thing in the 37th century? Sure enough, it was a talent. At the side door of the Shell Motor Company, the young people who had just finished their exams waved goodbye. However, when they looked at the group of people in the first military academy, they could not help but feel a little complicated. This was all because of the guy standing next to Zhou Yu. The blonde Park Ji-ho slowly walked in front of the people from the first military academy. He first nodded slightly to greet Zhou Yu, then he stared at the ordinary-looking Su Lu. After a moment of silence, he asked, "I still don't understand why the Research Institute and the Engineering Department have chosen you." Anda looked at this person with disgust and said gruffly, "You idiot. Of course it's because you did well in the exam." The students from the first military academy did not have a good impression of Su Lu. They had even mocked him at the beginning. However, under Zhou Yu's influence, their performance was much better than the other examinees. Anda felt that Su Lu was an awesome person, and he seemed to be Zhou Yu's friend. Of course, he would stand up and be a door god, and play the bad guy. After Park Ji-ho left, Zhou Yu smiled at Su Lu and said, "The bus back to school is waiting for us. Are you going the same way?" Su Lu shook his head. The two exchanged contact information and waved goodbye. When the side door returned to silence, he retracted his gaze from the street and walked into the automatic tunnel beside the flower bed. He walked towards the parking lot at the corner of West 13th Street. The parking lot in the basement of the Capital Special District was very clearly planned. Moreover, the parking lot was exceptionally large. It was the size of 5 football fields. Su Lu gripped the armrest tightly under the dim light. He felt a little strange in his heart. The bloody mecca in the underground parking lot of Linhai Gymnasium had always been a rather depressing memory in his mind. The automatic caterpillar tunnel carried his body forward in the parking lot. He narrowed his eyes and thought, when was the last time he played football? It seemed to be 6 or 7 years ago at the back of Zhonglo Street. He played with Weizi and the others. Ever since he met Uncle Feng Yu and started to repair home appliances, he never played again. When he arrived at the H section of the parking lot, Su Lu pressed the key in his hand. Not far away, a black car automatically ignited and let out a soft welcoming sound. He glanced at the H section above the parking lot and could not help but smile. He thought of the young man he met in the H section. The black car had no logo. It was a gift from Tai Ziyuan to Su Lu before he left. After sitting in the car, Su Lu did not immediately leave. Instead, he silently closed his eyes and began to think about what happened at the Shell Motor Company today. Leaning against the comfortable seat, Su Lu closed his eyes as if he was about to fall asleep. Entering the Shell Motor Company, on one hand, was because this was his dream and the future he had promised to someone. More importantly, it was because he needed to solve some problems that were very troubling to him. The images in his mind were too strange. There were many blueprints that he did not know the purpose of. Today, during the exam, he found a very similar blueprint, which made him more determined. He had to figure out the strange things that were happening in his body as soon as possible. He had to figure out what was going on with that strange black dream. If these things were related to the chip behind his neck, then he had to figure out the secret of this camouflage chip. The best places in the Federation in this area were the Federal Academy of Science and the Shell Motor Company. His performance today and the sensation he caused were completely different from his usual style of doing things. This was because he knew that in a top company like the Shell Motor Company, with his ability, there was no need to talk about hiding. In order to climb up the ranks among countless outstanding peers, in order to possibly come into contact with the core technology of the Federation in a very short period of time, he had to fully utilize his ability. Only technology could be used to get close to technology itself. It was also because of this reason. Although the Human Resources Director of the Engineering Department patiently explained the pros and cons of the two in the office, as well as the problems of the Research Institute, he still chose to follow Professor Shen into the Research Institute. After all, the research of the Shell Motor Company in the field of microchips was recognized by the Federation as second to none. Su Le knew that he had some talent in the field of mechanical repair, and in the few years he had followed Uncle Fengyu, he had unknowingly grasped a lot of knowledge about high-end equipment in the Federation from the process of repairing home appliances. But he also knew that if the Black Dream didn't leave him with so many strange blueprints, he definitely wouldn't have been able to solve the last question in today's exam. Thinking of this, he opened his eyes. His eyes revealed a trace of reminiscence. His right hand subconsciously touched the back of his neck. Although his finger didn't feel any protrusion, he knew that there was an extremely small chip underneath. Uncle is the truly awesome person. Su Le exclaimed in his heart. He always thought that the blueprints that appeared in front of his eyes due to the abnormal discharge of his brain were the information that Uncle left in the chip. Although he didn't understand how so much information could be integrated into a microchip, he clearly understood that his brain was now equivalent to an extremely large and complex database. What he didn't know was that the blueprints in his mind were things that didn't even exist in the Federal Academy of Science's database. And these pictures weren't left in the chip by Uncle, but by a great existence of data. In order to wake him up from his coma, it used the second type of communication method. What he didn't know was that he was the fugitive with the best luck in the universe. Chapter 155. The reason why Su Le had always assumed that the dark dream, as well as the series of images that appeared on his retina, was something that Uncle Fengyu had left in the chip, and did not think in any other direction, was because of the inertia of human thought. Since Su Le knew that there was a problem with the chip, naturally, when a strange situation occurred, he would think in that direction. Naturally, he would not have thought that it was the glory of the charter of human society that had created such a miraculous outcome. This was because he had always thought that as long as the Bureau of Proclamation discovered the problem with his chip, then what awaited him would be the end of the road as a fugitive. For Su Le, the more convincing evidence was actually the various pictures of beautiful women mixed in with those images. Other than that lecherous uncle who frequented the sanatorium for prostitutes, who else would use such cutting-edge technology to seal these useless pornographic images into the chip and store them in his mind? Su Le's lips curled into a bitter smile, and he muttered to himself, "This lecherous fellow, should I call you Fengyu, or Professor Jean? How many identities did you actually have in the past?" Pursued by the federal military in the Donglin region, replaced with a brand new chip in the suburbs of Heshi region, followed the method left by Uncle Fengyu to leave the planet full of mining pits, entered Yue University with a recommendation letter of unknown content, accidentally entered Section H1 of the library in Section H, and met Tai Ziyuan from there. The mysterious power in his body, the faint connection between this power and the ice-cold metal mecha, the dark dream after he had fainted, the scenes in the dream, link after link, until today, Su Le was very confident that all of this was related to Fengyu. At least, some of the links were definitely the result of someone's deliberate arrangement. He did not know whether this arrangement was good or bad, but at least he knew that he was still alive. The other side of being alive was that he already knew that he was no longer an ordinary person, and naturally could not expect to live the life of an ordinary person. On his left hand was an inconspicuous metal bracelet. Su Le narrowed his eyes as he looked at the bracelet, thinking about the chip inside that was as bright as a star. He had also thought about whether he should try out all the chips in the bracelet to see the identity and life that those chips represented. However, the pain of replacing the chips made his heart palpitate. He was also worried that this kind of unnecessary action would trigger the glory of the charter, so he never took the risk. Instead, he took it slowly according to his character. There was also a thought that was deeply rooted in his heart that prevented him from using the rest of the chips in the bracelet for the time being. In his conjecture, before Uncle Feng Yu came to the Eastwood region, he must have been like a mysterious ghost with 3,000 incarnations, floating in the starry sky of the Federation and traveling the world. And this kind of life that was destined to be impossible to stay in one place for a long time, destined to be separated from the people and things around him, was not what Su Le wanted. With a slight movement of his left hand, the car slowly started. With a low and pleasant sound, it drove out of the underground parking lot like a ghost. A very ordinary black car without obvious signs was driving on the streets of the capital special district. Su Le looked at the street beside the car expressionlessly, trying to get away from the prompts of the electronic map as soon as possible and familiarize himself with the streets and alleys of the capital. Another important reason for choosing the Research Institute instead of the Engineering Department was that the Nutshell Engineering Department was in Harbor City, and the Research Institute was in the capital special district. The final battlefield of the upcoming presidential election would definitely be in the capital special district. He would definitely stay on the battlefield to see what would happen to the counselor named Macklin. Su Le never thought that Tai Ziyuan owed him anything, and he was very clear that big shots at that level, even if they respected friendship, could still give up anything in the face of family interests. He could not put all his hopes on that distant friend of his. He had to watch in person. If everything did not go as he wished in the future, perhaps he would do something himself. At least Tai Ziyuan had given him a car that he really wanted. In the snowstorm of Linhai, he had followed Shi Qinghai to escape the pursuit of the Federation Investigation Bureau. The experience of running wildly on that stretch of road had deeply affected Su Le. The first time he had driven a car, and he had driven so crazily. That kind of thrill, that kind of nervousness and excitement, and that feeling of perfect unity between man and machine, all made Su Le fall in love with driving. This was very similar to the feeling of operating a mecha, but it was more direct, so the thrill was even more intense. Even so, the black car driving on the streets of the capital at this time was exceptionally stable, maintaining a speed of around 70 km per hour. This was due to his personality. In front of the public, Su Le was still that somewhat stuffy, somewhat wooden fellow. The capital special district did not occupy a large area, but it gathered all of the important government departments of the Human Federation, as well as the various administrative agencies under the management committee. In addition to those large corporate headquarters that spanned across several star systems, there was not much extra land left. Thus, the cost of living in the special district was rather high. Until today, other than those high-class residential districts that belonged to the Federation government, there was no other residential district that could be formed. Most Federation citizens living in the capital would live in the 7 satellite cities within a radius of 100 kilometers or so of the capital special district. The apartment that Su Le had rented in advance was in City 2. After bypassing the traffic, the black car silently and steadily got onto Highway 2. It began to speed up without anyone noticing. Perhaps the car's stability was too strong, or perhaps the driver's ability was too good, but despite gradually exceeding 100 km per hour, there was no sense of high speed. Soothing music began to play, and Su Le pressed the touch screen to call up the car's computer system. He began to drive the car while diligently learning about the relevant aspects of the car. During the assassination in the Linhai State underground parking lot, the incomparably strong anti-attack capabilities of this black car had left an extremely deep impression on Su Le. He knew that this car was definitely not as simple as it looked on the outside. It was just that after receiving the car at the capital airport, he had not had much time to study it, so he did not know what other remarkable aspects of the car's craftsmanship were. Just as Su Le was engrossed in his thoughts, the car's computer suddenly beeped with an alarm. Beep, beep, dangerous vehicle approaching. Su Le's nerves suddenly tightened, but before he had time to react, he only saw an extremely bright red shadow on his left. With a whoosh, it overtook the car, leaving behind only a strong gust of wind. The alarm was lifted, and Sulu silently watched the red sports car leave, leaving behind a trail of dust. He recognized that it was one of the Federation's top luxury cars, the Lotus, and the Red Lotus was the most eye-catching and expensive of these luxury cars. The reason why it was expensive was because the Red Lotus did not use clean energy, nor did it use hybrid power, but instead used an old-fashioned gasoline engine. Although it was old-fashioned, its power output was much higher than that of an electric car or a hybrid power car. Judging with the naked eye, Sulu determined that the Red Lotus was going at least 200 km per hour when it overtook him. The capital special region was filled with high-ranking officials, and naturally there was also a group of young people with special privileges. These rich young people did not need to serve in the military, and had nothing to do all day long, so they could only look for supplements in the spiritual world. Some people might bury themselves in books, some would sink into the sea of lust, some would explore everywhere, but most people still chose to look for all kinds of excitement. Drag racing was, without a doubt, the most historical and most popular kind of activity. After all, this was the capital special region. Countless powers and countless media outlets had their eyes on this place. These descendants of influential people were relatively restrained, but in the other provinces, these descendants of influential people were even more arrogant. Sulu had also heard that these descendants of influential people in the capital special region were not very willing to drag race on the streets of the special region, because it could easily cause trouble for their parents. Moreover, there were too many high-ranking officials in the special region, so who knew what kind of trouble they could not afford to provoke. These descendants of influential people mostly chose to drag race on the roads leading out of the city, especially the highways leading to several satellite cities, as well as the inner streets of the satellite cities. Sulu did not expect that he would encounter a drag racer just a few days after arriving in the capital special region. Being overtaken by the Red Lotus in a dangerous and provocative manner, Sulu's mood did not change in the slightest. Different from his age, he had already experienced too many things, so naturally he was not that easily angered, nor was he that competitive. Just like the black car he was driving at this time, keeping it to himself was a common trait of their personalities. Sulu did not have the impulse to cause trouble, but trouble took the initiative to find him. He watched as the figure of the Red Lotus slowed down and gradually became clearer. His eyes gradually narrowed. The other party had slowed down, so they must be waiting for something. He could only hope that it was not waiting for his unremarkable black car. However, what made him feel somewhat helpless was that the Red Lotus's target was him. Especially when he reduced the speed to 30 km per hour, which was already exceeding the speed limit of the highway, the Red Lotus still did not leave because of his retreat. Instead, it also reduced its speed. In the end, this Red Lotus, shockingly braked directly and abruptly stopped in front of Sulu, firmly blocking the black car's path. Sulu frowned slightly, not understanding what was going on. A girl came down from the Red Lotus and walked directly in front of the black car, looking over coldly. In the chilly weather of early spring, this girl wore a short red windbreaker. The windbreaker reached her knees, revealing a pair of seductive legs. The girl coldly looked at the black car, but her gaze gradually turned cold and even somewhat despairing. Tears gushed out, turning the heavy makeup on her eyes into 2 lines of black rain. Chapter 156. Through the glass, Sulu looked at the crying girl in red. For some reason, a part of his heart was touched, and he felt a little sour. He knew that the glass of this black car was a little strange, and that people outside could not see the people inside the car. Therefore, he was sure that this girl named Zoe must have mistaken him for someone else. He just did not know why she was crying so sadly. In Linhai Prefecture's 13, a nightclub that used the ancient language to pretend to be cultured, the red-clothed girl was an extremely cold and arrogant daughter of a powerful family. In Yale University's Double Moon Festival Ball, the red-clothed girl pretended to be a calm and elegant daughter of a rich family. But no matter which one it was, Sulu didn't like her very much. Although he and Shi Qinghai were a team, they had never been at a disadvantage in front of this girl named Zoyu, who was used to wearing red. But Sulu did not think that he would have the slightest good impression of this girl. He only felt a little disgust. But for some reason, on the highway on the outskirts of the capital's special administrative region, far away from Linhai, seeing this woman crying helplessly and hopelessly, seeing her beautiful face covered in heavy makeup that gradually turned into ink rain, Sulu actually felt some sympathy for her. Probably because not long ago, he had also cried helplessly and hopelessly. We only see each other twice in 2 years. In these few months, other than sending me a New Year's greeting card, you don't even want to see me. Why is that? Do you know how painful it has been these past few months? Of course, you are the high and mighty crown prince. What am I? I am a woman that your family gave you with both hands. You don't even like me. Even if I am nothing, we were friends in the past. Don't you care about me at all? I don't want that kind of care. It's just that my mood is really bad right now. There are a lot of things that I don't dare to tell my family. And now you disappeared too. Zhou cried, and even shouted hysterically at the black car. Her slightly curly hair was draped over her shoulders, and her extremely thick makeup was like a colorful wall that had been washed away by rain, revealing the miserable and pale skin underneath. Sulu had occasionally heard Tai Ziyuan mention the Zhou family siblings at the general hospital and at the seaside. Most of the time, it was about Zhou. Tai Ziyuan had asked him to forget about the conflict in Linhai Prefecture. After all, the Zhou family was the influence that the Tai family had nurtured in the Federation government. In those two conflicts, Sulu and Shi Qinghai didn't suffer any losses. In fact, they even took advantage of the situation. Therefore, he didn't take it seriously and had completely forgotten about this ruthless girl in red. Who would have thought that he would meet her in the outskirts of the special district of the capital city today? What's more, she was different from her usual self. She seemed particularly desperate and real. Sulu knew that this girl in red must have mistaken him for Tai Ziyuan because of this unmarked black car. That was why she was so angry and lost her composure. He narrowed his eyes slightly. He didn't know how to solve this problem in front of him, but he knew that he couldn't let her continue to misunderstand him. Otherwise, if she said something more serious, the trouble would become even bigger. He gently pressed a button, and the car's computer immediately responded. The window that was covered with a layer of film gradually turned transparent, revealing Su Li's ordinary face. Zhou angry words came to an abrupt halt. She looked at the young man in the black car in astonishment. She was somewhat puzzled, and then shocked speechless. She easily recognized Su Lu. When she thought about how her previous loss of composure was completely seen by this hateful young man, endless shame and embarrassment welled up in her heart. This feeling was so strong that it turned into anger in the end. She fiercely glared at Su Lu on the other side of the car window. She wiped the tears on her face, and without saying anything, simply returned to her Red Lotus sports car, leaving behind a stunned and speechless Su Lu. Seeing the Red Lotus sports car start to move, Su Li's eyebrows slightly furrowed. He lightly stepped on the accelerator, and the black car started to move again. He followed her from a distance. He didn't know what he had discovered, but he didn't choose to leave this troublesome person. The two cars in front and behind didn't go too fast. They drove on the second highway toward the second city district. Su Lu had discovered something, so he decided to temporarily follow the cold young lady for a while. However, Zhou, who was sitting in the Red Lotus sports car in front of him, didn't leave at high speed for some unknown reason. At this moment, the car's computer's warning sounded again. A completely serene blue luxury sports car overtook the black car in the left lane at high speed, leaving behind a blue streak of light. In an instant, it disappeared at the curve in front of them. The speed was really too fast. Su Li's thighs slightly twitched, feeling a trace of nervousness and awe. This was because he discovered that when this serene blue luxury sports car quickly entered the curve, the Red Lotus in front of them also instantly sped up. The two cars simultaneously drove at a terrifying speed toward the end of the second highway. After that chase with the Federation Investigation Bureau, Sulu fell in love with the feeling of driving. He also crammed his knowledge on cars. He recognized at a glance that the serene blue sports car's brand name was Silver Spirit. The full name was Silver Wraith, and the serene blue Silver Wraith was the most expensive in this series. Once the horsepower was fully unleashed, its speed was extremely shocking. However, it was also extremely expensive. It wasn't a car that the average child of a powerful family could own. Zhou Engxing had already become the Deputy Minister of National Defense of the Federation. No matter how amazing the background of a second-generation figure was, it was impossible for them to really hurt Miss Zhou. Moreover, Su Le couldn't find any reason to worry about the safety of that cold young lady. However, he didn't know why, but after a moment of silent contemplation, he stepped on the gas pedal to its limit. The black car suddenly turned into a black shadow in the twilight on the outskirts of the capital. It looked more like a real ghost than the Silver Wraith in front of it. It was incomparably smooth and stable as it quickly followed, trailing behind the blue and red wind lines from a distance. Su Le's expression was heavy, and a faint anger appeared in his eyes. His hands gently placed on the steering wheel, his eyes looking straight ahead as he allowed the car's computer to search for his target. The black car had already entered the second satellite city of the capital, the city known as Wangdu. At this time, pedestrians and cars had been on the streets for a long time. It was very lively, and the two sports cars he had been following were long gone. Su Le was angry at himself because he had lost track of the other party, but because he had witnessed the speed of the two sports cars with his own eyes, he really couldn't feel happy. In such a crowded area, the two sports cars, Red Lotus and Blue Wraith, didn't slow down at all. They ran a few red lights and were surrounded by danger. There were a few times when they almost hit pedestrians crossing the road. Although Zhou Yu and the people in the Blue Wraith sports car were very skilled at driving and didn't cause any tragedies in the end, Su Le, who witnessed everything from behind, felt his heart sink. People who didn't care about the lives of ordinary Federation citizens really made him feel ashamed. On the highway, Su Le's black car followed the two sports cars in front of him from afar. The high-speed black car still maintained a stable trajectory, giving people a visual illusion. However, its speed was already close to the two expensive sports cars in front. However, after entering the city, Su Le couldn't do such a despicable thing. He could only watch as the two cars rolled up the green leaves and disappeared in front of the street under the remote highway of Wangdu City. The street lights were dim, and it was unusually quiet. At the entrance to the mountain near Qingshan Park, there were 5 sports cars of different styles and colors, but they were all extremely luxurious and expensive. One of them was a bright red Lotus sports car with a slightly deformed front cover. It was leaning against the mountain rock wall, and beside it was a 1-meter deep drainage ditch. A few well-dressed young men were currently whispering something to the red Lotus sports car. None of them noticed that a black car was slowly driving over like a ghost. Through the window, Su Le looked at the crashed red sports car from afar. He noticed that Zhou Yu was squatting by the drainage ditch and vomiting non-stop. He didn't know if it was because of the shock or because she was frightened. Su Le looked over there in silence. He had a strange feeling in his heart. Although he knew that his guess was a bit ridiculous, if it was true, he had to get confirmation from the other party. This was because to him, this was related to his most important friend. He couldn't ignore it. Those well-dressed young people were definitely trouble. Su Le didn't want to cause trouble. He originally wanted to wait for the other party to disperse before asking Zhou Yu in private. However, he suddenly realized that the cars seemed to be preparing to continue racing on the night road up the mountain. Moreover, Zhou Yu, who was vomiting, seemed to want to change cars to continue. It was too dangerous to race on the mountain road at night. Su Le drove the car to the side of the girl in red, and the door opened automatically. He hesitated for a moment, lowered the window, handed over a bottle of purified water and a tissue, and said, "Do you want to take a rest in the car?" When the black car approached the entrance of Qingshan Park, those well-dressed young people noticed it. Especially a few of them who were quite knowledgeable about cars. When they heard the sound of the black car, they felt that something was wrong. Their eyes lit up. Zhou Yu took the water in shock. Her makeup was still a mess because of her tears. Especially now that it had dried up, it looked even weirder. She took the tissue and water, but didn't drink. Instead, she wiped her face. It seemed that no matter what kind of situation she was in, women always cared about their face the most. After a moment of silence, for some unknown reason, she actually went around to the other side of the gate and got into the black car. "Why are you following me? You've been following me from the highway to here. Aren't you Zhang Xiaoming's boyfriend?" Sitting in the passenger seat, Zhou naturally unbuttoned her red trench coat and sneered. Although she didn't necessarily think that Su Lu was a guy who was obsessed with her appearance, the blade in her words flew in that direction. It had to be said that Zhou was a very beautiful woman. Especially now that the heavy makeup on her face was gone, revealing the real delicate skin underneath. She returned to her true age and added a bit of radiance to her appearance. "Zhang Xiaoming is dead." Su Lu was silent for a moment before he answered softly. The black car suddenly fell into a strange silence. Zhou seemed to want to say something, but in the end, she just sneered and didn't speak. Chapter 157. Upon hearing the news of Zhang Xiaoming's death, Zhou fell silent. Although she wasn't close with the girl, she was still someone she knew. Especially recently, she found that because of that incident, she had some endocrine imbalance and became sentimental. In order to not let her eyes become moist for no reason, she chose to make her face more indifferent and her mind more empty. At that moment, she heard Su Li's question. This question was very natural. It was like a young woman in a coffee shop covering her mouth and giggling while asking a female friend next to her. It was also like a mother nervously and joyfully asking her daughter. No one knew about that incident. In order to hide it, Zhou, who had already fallen out with her family, simply moved out. For so many days, she hadn't told anyone about this incident. It weighed on her heart, making her feel extremely painful and troubled. Su Li's ordinary face and gentle and steady pace of speech often made the people around him feel close and trustworthy. Although Zhou wasn't his friend, when she heard such a natural question, the pressure that had accumulated over the past few days seemed to have found a breakthrough. She naturally replied bitterly, "It's been more than 3 months." As soon as this sentence came out, Zhou's expression suddenly froze. She suddenly turned around and stared coldly at Su Li's face. After Su Lu confirmed his guess, the expression on his face became more serious and concerned. "How did you know?" The extremely cold expression didn't last long. It immediately collapsed into a pale and slightly panicked face. Zhou looked at Su Lu and asked in a trembling voice. Su Li's eyes lowered and landed on her lower abdomen. If it weren't for his sharper eyes than the average person, he definitely wouldn't have noticed the slight bump. "You're pregnant. Why are you still racing?" "It's too dangerous," Su Lu said. There was no makeup on Zhou's face. She was pure and beautiful. When she heard the word pregnant, a trace of desolation suddenly appeared on her face. It was just like that morning a long time ago when she left an unfamiliar apartment. She burst into tears like a broken pot. "It's none of your business. If I remember correctly, we don't know each other that well. In fact, we've always been enemies," Zhou said. Su Lu had no interest in arguing with her. He only knew that he had guessed one thing correctly, and with the confirmation of her pregnancy date, his second guess was about to come to fruition. On the night after the Double Moon Festival ball, the pair involved in the scene on the grass beside the Rose River did not know that he had already seen it. Su Lu was silent as he considered his choice of words. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that the few well-dressed young men beside the car had already cast strange glances at his car. Without waiting for him to open his mouth to ask, Zhou suddenly said coldly, "I didn't expect the Crown Prince to actually give you this car. It seems like you really are a subordinate that the Tai family values. He has a lot of cars." "It's not strange that he gave me one," Su Lu corrected. "I'm not his subordinate. I'm his friend." Hearing the word friend, Zhou's slightly red eyes flashed with a strange light. She immediately said mockingly, "Someone like him has friends? Someone like you is worthy of being his friend?" These words were very disdainful and humiliating, but Sula acted as if he didn't hear it at all. How is the crown prince now? I don't know. I haven't contacted him in a few days. Originally, he was supposed to finish studying in Lin Hai for half a year and then directly go to the West Woods to join the army. However, since he ended his studies early, I don't know where he will go. Looking at the lonely girl in red beside him, Sula slightly narrowed his eyes. Only now did he remember that this girl and Tai Ziyuan were the same year. She was younger than him and was a real girl. However, in the past, the vitality and innocence that a young girl should have was covered up by her cold personality and gorgeous makeup. After Zhou Yu heard about Tai Ziyuan's recent situation, she became silent. Her rosy lips slightly opened as if she wanted to continue asking, but in the end, she only remained silent. Seeing her companions walking towards the car, she was about to get out of the car when Sulu called her back. Don't go racing. It's too dangerous for you and others, Sulu said softly to her as he looked out the window at the expensive blue sports car not far away. Zhou Yu laughed mockingly. Who do you think you are? You actually dare to control me like that old man of mine? Whether you live or die has nothing to do with me. I also don't like trash like you who don't care about human lives. Sulu was rarely so mean. He turned his head and looked at her with narrowed eyes. He said word by word, but right now, the life in your belly has a lot to do with me, so naturally, I have to control you. Zhou Yu was a smart person. She didn't misunderstand these words. Instead, she very sensitively discovered that this ordinary person named Sulu. Perhaps he had already guessed the true identity of the father of the child in her belly. This was because she knew very well that this person and Sulu beside her were very close friends. Her face suddenly became even paler. She looked at Sulu in a daze. In her shock, she forgot to get out of the car. The few well-dressed young people were originally discussing the night run. However, when they saw Zhou Yu get into the black car that suddenly arrived, they were silent. They were guessing the identity of the black car's owner in their hearts. These people's families had considerable status in the special capital region. However, their father's company had to maintain a good relationship with the National Defense Department's Deputy Minister Zhou, who was in charge of logistics. Naturally, they didn't want to disturb the conversation between Miss Zhou and her friends. Where do you live? I'll send you back and ask you some questions. I can't leave yet. I lost a bet with someone today. If I can't win it back in the night run, I have to pay for the bet. For some reason, Zhou Yu calmly explained. The people outside the car seemed to be a little impatient, especially when the blue silver Spirit sports car flashed its lights twice. A young man walked to the car window, gently knocked, and said with a smile, Sister Zhou, are you still running tonight? They're urging us. Although they didn't want to offend Zhou Yu, they didn't want to offend the owner of the blue silver Spirit sports car even more. Although until tonight they still didn't know the name of the owner of the car, they had been warned from all sides that this was a big shot that they couldn't afford to offend. At this time, a middle-aged man got out of the blue silver Spirit sports car. He walked straight to Su Li's car and said coldly, Miss Zhou, the young master said that we have 3 people in the car, and he'll let you sit empty for 5 minutes. If you're not in the mood tonight, or you don't want to change cars, then please drink this bottle of wine. A bottle of aged wine was in the middle-aged man's hand. It seemed that today's bet on Highway 2 was a bottle of wine. It was strange. Although the descendants of the Federation's rich and powerful definitely wouldn't be so bored as to gamble, it was a bit surprising that they would only drink a bottle of wine. The car window slowly rolled down. Sula said, she won't be running today, and she won't drink the wine either. Sula thought of the thrilling scene on the streets of Wangdu City. He didn't have the slightest good impression of the person in the blue-silver Spirit sports car. It was the same for Zhou Yu, who drove the Red Lotus. He shouldn't have gotten involved in this trouble, but at this time, since he already knew that Zhou Yu's slightly swollen abdomen could be the descendant of that lazy guy, he definitely wouldn't let Zhou Yu race so crazily again. As for something like wine, could a pregnant woman drink it? Su Li's reply made the middle-aged man slightly stunned. Immediately, a gloomy expression appeared on his face. He thought that his young master had already given enough face to this young miss from the Zhou family by only letting her drink a bottle of wine as a gesture. He didn't expect that the owner of the black car, who had suddenly appeared, would reject him so cleanly and without giving him any face. "This is between my young master and Miss Zhou. May I ask who you are?" He didn't know the identity of the ordinary-looking young man in the black car, but he thought that since the other party was sitting together with Zhou Yu, he must not be an ordinary person, so his tone of reply was still polite. Before Su Lu could answer, Zhou Yu replied with a faint smile, "I don't know him. I overtook his car on the road, but I didn't expect him to follow me here." Su Li's pair of knife-like eyebrows furrowed slightly. He knew that the woman beside him had habitually started to cause trouble again. The middle-aged man walked toward the blue sports car, but the expressions of the well-dressed young men beside the car changed slightly. They believed Zhou Yu's words and thought that Su Lu was just an outsider. "Don't interfere in things you don't understand." One of them narrowed his eyes and looked at Su Lu. He said, "I heard that the sound of your car is not bad. Looks like it took a lot of effort to modify it. Do you want to go one round? I'm not someone who doesn't take my life and other people's lives seriously." Su Lu didn't have a good impression of these people outside the car, and Zhou Yu's words put him in a bad mood. Although he still spoke calmly, there was a trace of impoliteness in his tone. "I'm giving you face, but you don't want it." The young man's expression changed. He kicked the car door heavily and scolded, "Get out of the car." Whether it was in the nightclub or in the GU, Su Lu was used to the faces of these people in the Federation's privileged class, so he was not surprised by the other party's violent reaction. He was not worried that the other party's foot would be hurt. The car window rolled up, blocking out the scolding outside. He turned to look at Zhou Yu and said, "Why do you have to cause trouble for me? With your status, since you came to provoke me, trouble will naturally accompany you." Zhou Yu glanced at the people outside the car, but had no intention of getting out. She smiled and said, "You rejected the other party on my behalf. In their eyes, this is a very embarrassing thing. Since you have already offended them, you have to completely subdue them. To put it bluntly, this is what this circle is all about." There was a trace of tiredness and coldness in her indifferent smile. She said, "If you can be more arrogant than them, they naturally won't dare to be arrogant in front of you." Those arrogant young people had already blocked in front of Su Li's car. Two of them were even preparing to go back to the car to get their weapons. It seemed that these people didn't just disregard human life when they were racing, they were also the same on a normal day. Su Lu shook his head and said, "I don't want to take this kind of class, and I'm not a member of this circle. I really hate you people. For people like you, it seems that it is more appropriate to use your fists, just like outside the ball." He did not get out of the car to use his fists, although he knew very well that when it came to fists, there were probably not many people in the Federation who were a match for him. Even the special forces of the Federation were the same. He stepped on the accelerator. The car under him suddenly sped up. Amid the screeching sound of the tires grinding against the ground at high speed, it rushed forward. Zhou Yu's face paled. She looked at the people in front of the car and the expensive sports car and screamed, "What are you doing?" Chapter 158. Under the violent impact, the white sports car was bounced up from the ground and then fell to the ground deformed like a crispy biscuit. The distance between the two workshops was too close, so the impact couldn't be too big, so the deformation wasn't too serious. However, the smooth curve of the car's waist could only be judged as ugly. It lost all its beauty and looked very miserable. Especially at that moment, the sound of metal being deformed and torn apart was a great torture to the eardrums. Su Lu stepped on the accelerator, and the black car crashed, shocking the group of Federation rich and powerful people. They had seen ruthless people, but they had never seen such a ruthless person. They were used to their arrogance, but they didn't expect that someone would use such an indifferent attitude to suppress their arrogance. These people scattered with pale faces, afraid that the guy in the black car would go 70 kilometers per hour at the entrance of Green Mountain Park. The door of the dark blue Spectre sports car that had been parked at the side opened. The middle-aged man who looked like a butler got out of the front passenger seat and said to the black car in a more respectful tone than before, "Friend in the car, young master would like to invite you for a drink." The bet was a bottle of wine, which wasn't a big deal in itself, but now it became a drink. The faces of the scattered young people changed slightly, as if they didn't expect that the person in the car, who was known for his ruthlessness, would be so afraid of the person in the black car that he didn't even hesitate to show weakness. Even the housekeeper didn't know why the young master in the car would ask him to come out and smooth things over for the young masters after a moment of silence. However, to everyone's surprise, the person in the black car didn't answer, and directly continued to step on the accelerator. In the sound of impact, the car squeezed out a path at the entrance of Green Mountain Park, turned into a silent black phantom smoke, and disappeared from everyone's sight extremely quickly. After a while, a young man cursed loudly and angrily and threw the golf club in his hand to the ground. It was only then that he realized that the white sports car he liked very much had been forcefully knocked into the drainage ditch of the mountain rain by that unknown black car. The drainage ditch beside the mountain road was not deep, only about 1 meter deep. The scene of the white sports car slowly falling into the ditch with a mournful cry left a deep impression on him. The blue Phantom sports car opened its door in the pleasant mechanical sound of electric current, and 2 young people got out of the car. One of them had blonde hair, a tall and straight figure, and was indescribably handsome. It was the ace student of the 3rd Military Academy, Park Ji-ho. The mixture of the aura of a military officer and a playboy gave a very deep impression to people. But Park Ji-ho's presence could not overshadow the presence of the person beside him. That person was about 25 or 26 years old. His facial features were deep, and his eyes were gloomy and calm. He was wearing a set of casual clothes that did not seem to be branded. Just by standing there casually, he exuded the aura of someone who did not care to break the snow. "I don't know which family he is from, but he didn't recognize your car." Park Ji-ho slightly frowned and said. Although his tone was very calm when talking to the person next to him, trying to speak in a tone of equality, there was still a little concession and respect in the details. The man in casual clothes smiled slightly and said, "That black car looks ordinary, but it's actually very good. It has been following me and Zoyu since the highway, and we couldn't get rid of him. Since Zoyu knows that person, and is so obedient to him, he must be from that family." "Thai family? Impossible, that prince has always been mysterious, but as far as I know, no matter where he appears now, there must be countless security personnel following him. I didn't say Tai Ziyuan, after all, I haven't seen that prince." The young man in casual clothes gradually stopped smiling and said, "Such a deliberately ordinary car, and it doesn't have a military license plate. Only the Thai family, who always likes to be mysterious and low-key, would do something like this." After his smile disappeared, the corner of his mouth naturally curved into a mocking curve. "Very few people have seen the heir of the Thai family. How many years has it been? That family still refuses to lower themselves, and only knows how to pretend to be mysterious. However, no matter how mysterious they are still being watched. The incident at the beginning of the year can be considered a lesson." When Park Ji-ho heard this, he smiled slightly and didn't say anything. He was a very outstanding and proud young man, but unfortunately, in front of the person next to him, he didn't have much to be proud of. Since that was the case, he might as well not talk too much. He knew very well that the person next to him was the same as himself, and didn't know the truth of the incident in Linhai. The Federation government and the Thai family covered up the incident very tightly. The other important people in the upper class of the Federation only knew about the incident, but not the details. "I heard that Lady Tai has always liked the daughter of Deputy Minister Zhou." The young man in casual clothes narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "I've already given enough face. The other party didn't give face to that last glass of wine, but I won't get angry over something like this." At the end of the mountain road in the distance, the lights were turned on and off. It seemed that the black car had already circled around this section of the road and entered Gwangdu City. Park Ji-ho frowned slightly and looked in that direction, then smiled in his heart. He knew that the person next to him with a terrifying family background was actually very afraid of the Tai family. Otherwise, there was no way he wouldn't have chased after them earlier. It was just that he didn't dare to offend the person next to him, and at the same time, he was also grateful that the other party had specially come to the capital's West Street to pick him up today, so he still just smiled and said nothing. Those people's fathers were all big businessmen, so it's okay to offend them. But in the end, you shouldn't have ignored the people in that car and just left. On the quiet night road of Wangdu, the black car drove steadily like a ghost. The girl in red in the passenger seat stared blankly at the lights outside the front window and suddenly opened her mouth to speak. Su Le didn't respond. He knew that since the other party had spoken, she definitely had to explain something to him. Zhou Yu turned her head and looked at Su Lu with a somewhat complicated gaze. It was rare for her to be kind and said, "Those people don't know, but I do." In the blue sports car sat the seventh son of the Li family, Li Xiaotong. The Li family of the seven great families? Yes. After a moment of silence, Su Le said, "I suddenly feel that those big shots who should have been in the clouds, the mysterious class, why is it so easy for me to see them now?" Zhou Yu looked at him with slight ridicule and said, "You are lucky to have met Tai Ziyuan. Naturally, you will be further and further away from the world you originally lived in." Su Le didn't answer this question. He thought silently. In fact, before he met Tai Ziyuan, he had already met the little girl of the Zhong family of the seven great families. No matter how he looked at it, the real reason that changed his life and brought him closer and closer to those legendary families was the uncle and the chip in his neck. Li Xiaotong is the nephew of the head of the Li family. In the younger generation, according to age, he is ranked 7th. He is not a guy with a good character. Today's racing bet, he already gave me enough face. In the end, he only asked you to drink a cup. It's rare that he was so reasonable. In the end, you just walked away like that. In the Federation, there are some people and some families that you can't offend. Considering your relationship with Tai Ziyuan, I have to remind you. Thank you. Su Li's "thank you" was very natural and sincere. Since the other party was a member of the seven great families, a nobody like him could only hide far away. Even if he knew Tai Ziyuan, it was still the same. The relationship between friends and blood was so strong that it didn't take too long to come to an answer. Actually, drinking a cup of wine is nothing. I just don't want them to see my face, Su Le said. And the most important thing is that you can't drive after drinking. The night of early spring gradually cooled down like water. Zhou Yu tightened the short red windbreaker on her body. Su Le increased the temperature in the car. She lowered her head and thought for a moment. She looked at Su Li's side profile in the driver's seat. She looked at this guy who was not very old, but his temperament and reaction were different from his peers. She suddenly said, "I don't know you very well, but I know that you are a person who doesn't like to get into trouble." In the two conflicts in Linhai, Su Le had been forced to fight back. In fact, he had never wanted to take the initiative to get into trouble. "For the sake of the child in your belly, I don't want to get into trouble." Su Li's expression was a bit ugly. But then he remembered that she was pregnant, so he changed the topic. Since the other party is a member of the seven great families, they must know something about the Tai family. If they guessed that this car belonged to Tai Ziyuan, they might think that someone from the Tai family was in the car. The current situation is too sensitive. In order to avoid angering too many people, they definitely wouldn't dare to investigate this car. The assassination in Linhai Gymnasium embarrassed the Federation government. In the end, it ended with the suicide of a deputy minister of national defense and 7 officers of the 2nd Military Region. During such a sensitive time period, if someone tried to secretly investigate the core of the Tai family, it would definitely alarm many people. Zhou Yu looked at him with a bit of surprise. "Madam and I talked about you. We were both very grateful, or rather surprised, by your performance in the gymnasium, but I thought that you were a rare person who was overflowing with a sense of justice. I didn't expect that you would think about these things." Su Le remained silent. He didn't answer the question of overflowing because this wasn't the first time he heard it. Many years ago, he became an orphan. Together with Li Wei and the others, he had to survive in the complicated environment of Zhonglo Street. Therefore, he still retained some of his sensitivity towards the current situation. But he didn't know why, but in such a dangerous environment, his heart became clearer and clearer. Perhaps it was because of the death of his parents and younger sister, but Su Lo understood life, death, and wealth better than ordinary people. Therefore, he was calmer and his mind cleaner. He was like an opaque rock that wouldn't leave a mark after being washed by water, and wouldn't leave a speck of dust behind. This kind of person who didn't have any greed for the world and wanted very little would naturally be able to defend his outlook on life. There was no need for him to compromise too much. He could be strong and not be afraid of being broken. Among the group of orphans, there were many people who could see things clearly. Li Wei also understood it, but it was a different kind of understanding. Therefore, during those years, Li Wei was very ruthless to others and to himself. Su Lo believed that Li Wei, who had been in prison for a whole year, would definitely be able to get out in the future. However, he didn't know how he was doing now. Because of Su Li's silence, Zhou sensed something and looked at him curiously. She knew that this guy was confident that those people wouldn't dare to investigate who he was. Deep down, he was not afraid of the 7 great families. This kind of fearlessness was not referring to his ability, but his attitude. This kind of attitude was like the edge of a stone, making people feel a bit solemn. "You're pregnant, so don't drink." Su Lo turned his head to look at her. Under the dim light, the girl in red looked tired, her eyebrows relaxed, and her right hand gently stroking her abdomen. This picture immediately turned him from a stone into an incomparably wordy auntie. Chapter 159. I can see that you're still a traitor in your bones. That's why you have a pitiful natural hatred for those in the Federation who have wealth and power. Zhou gently stroked her lower abdomen. Not only was the bump there not obvious, but it was also impossible to see anything at all. That was why she didn't know how Su Lo could tell that she was pregnant. Right now, her words were mostly used to cover up her slight panic. Su Li's eyes were too sharp. He had been immersed in the world of metal circuits with Uncle Feng Yu for many years. Especially after he cultivated that mysterious power in his body, his eyes were even sharper. Even a difference of less than a millimeter would never escape his eyes. A human's body was obviously different from a machine's. However, a mechanic's bold guess and careful verification of the characteristics of his profession allowed him to successfully guess Zhou Yu's secret. The black car drove on the quiet streets of Wangdu. For a moment, the two of them were silent. After all, they weren't familiar with each other. In fact, they even hated each other in the past. It was even more difficult to find a topic to talk about compared to looking for pear blossoms in the winter snow of Linhai. After a moment of silence, Zhou indifferently asked about Tai Ziyuan's current situation. Su Lo remembered that this girl in red had asked him once before. However, he still calmly answered because he could see that her indifference was fake. He noticed that Zhou still didn't ask for that person's name after hesitating for a long time. He said, "Shi Qinghai is currently being secretly pursued by the Federation Investigation Bureau. However, he should be fine. As for where he is right now, I really don't know." Hearing the 3 words Shi Qinghai, Zhou knew that the man beside her had guessed her thoughts. A trace of anger flashed across her slightly pale cheeks. She deliberately made a few traces of harshness in the corner of her beautiful eyes. She lightly mocked, "Scourges live for thousands of years. It's not easy for a bitch like your friend to die. From your perspective, it's better for him to be alive. You can't let the child in your womb be born without a father," Su Lo replied. Su Lo had already guessed that the father of the fetus in Zhou Yu's belly was Shi Qinghai. Although Zhou Yu did not understand the reason, she knew that he had already guessed it. However, this sentence really opened up the matter. The red-clothed girl's heart felt as if it had been rubbed by the snowflakes by the Rose River. She felt a little sour, a little painful, and a little angry. In the past few months, her mood had been very low, but the reason for this was very complicated. She had been looking forward to the Double Moon Festival ball for a long time. In the end, it ended in a farce between Su Lu and Zhang Xiaoming. She felt humiliated and deeply sad, but after that, she realized that besides being sad and disappointed, there was also a sense of relief. Her father, Zhou Yingxing, was directly promoted from the position of the Ministry of Defense's Logistics Department to the position of Deputy Minister. From this, it seemed that the Tai family still did not stop supporting the Zhou family because of what happened at the ball. On the contrary, their support for the Zhou family increased. Was this compensation? Sometimes, she would sneer and think that what really made her mood fall to the bottom was the news of her pregnancy. Her period had not arrived, and the color of the pregnancy test paper had changed. This made her mood change, and she began to feel frustrated and helpless. From the moment she found out that she was pregnant, she knew who the father of the child was. That beautiful face with a mean smile and that pair of peach blossom eyes would occasionally appear in her imagination and dreams. However, when she found out that the rogue official who had slapped her and had a one-night stand with her had caused her to have a child, she could not accept this reality for a while. Lady Tai still occasionally invited her to have afternoon tea together. Her father and brother still believed that she would definitely become Tai Ziyuan's partner in the future. Over the years, Zhou Yu had been influenced by what she had seen and heard. She had always thought of herself as Tai Ziyuan's wife. Now that she was pregnant with another man's child, she actually felt a strange sense of shame and panic. She was like a girl who had been caught red-handed with the most concrete evidence. That cold, proud, and ruthless woman in red was only her disguise. The real her was a young girl who had not yet reached 20 years of age. Under such circumstances, she could no longer bear the burden. Before her family found out that she was pregnant, she had a big argument with her father and brother. She took the opportunity to move out and began to fool around with her peers in the upper circle of the Federation. She seemed to be crazy, but in reality, she was extremely frightened. She drove the fastest car, drank the strongest alcohol, and became increasingly crazy because she didn't know how to face her belly that was about to bulge. She really couldn't bear to kill the little life in her belly. Sometimes, she would be in a daze and think of the man with the pair of peach blossom eyes. However, if the situation continued to develop, it would be a problem. Perhaps subconsciously, she had some kind of self-destructive thought. Whether it was racing or drinking, they were all methods to destroy her life or the little life in her belly. Earlier, when those people saw me get in your car, they did not find it strange. Because in their eyes, maybe I am a very loose woman. Zhou Yu's face was pale, but she had a strong self-deprecating smile. Looking at the dark street outside the car window, she did not know where this car was going under the guidance of the electronic map. Her slightly dry lips moved slightly, and she said indifferently, "I did not expect that hooligan Shi Qinghai would tell you about what happened between us that night. This is very tasteless. But I have a lot of men, and I don't even know who the father of the child in my belly is. If you think that the father is your friend, and that is why you pestered me tonight, then you can stop the car now." Su Lu did not stop the car, nor did he turn his head to look at her with a very deep gaze to make her yield. He just looked at the front of the car and said slowly, "I don't know what your reputation is like outside. Even if it is, it should be something that happened recently. The existence of Lady Tai, Tai Ziyuan, and your family all guarantee that you are not a girl who casually has relations with others. I am Shi Qinghai's brother. I know that guy is indeed a hooligan, but there are really too few women who can resist his charm. Also, I happen to know that you two used to be together. I heard Tai Ziyuan talk about you before. I even know that when you two were in school together, there was that heavy truck accident that happened on the school street. Speaking of which, Tai Ziyuan has always felt guilty towards you." He continued, "He has always treated you as a childhood friend. Trust me, even if the Tai family knew that you were together with another man, they would not express too strongly. At most, Lady Tai would be a bit disappointed." Thinking about what Tai Ziyuan had said that day, Su Lu could not help but turn his head and glance at Zhou Yu's beautiful waist and butt. He thought that in the eyes of that lady, the most important thing about such a wonderful body was that it would be easy to give birth. It had to be said that the lady's taste was indeed very unique. Shi Qinghai and the girl in red next to him had only been together once, but the girl had already given birth to a baby. On one hand, it showed that Shi Qinghai was very capable. On the other hand, it also showed that the Zhou family's eldest daughter was indeed. Zhou Yu thought about the accident that happened when she was young, and her expression changed slightly. Then, she thought about the huge situation that she was in right now, and her face gradually turned pale. Her eyes saw a pack of cigarettes in front of the car, and she could not help but frown. She subconsciously took out a cigarette, and with trembling fingers, she lit the lighter. In the high-end apartment in Linhai City, the man with the pair of peach blossom eyes had this brand of cigarettes in his house. Su Li's smoking habit was basically cultivated by Shi Qinghai, so the cigarettes that he was used to smoking now were also of this brand. She only took a puff, and before the smoke could leave her red lips, the red light at the tip of the cigarette flashed slightly, and a hand reached out from the side and rudely snatched the cigarette away. Zhou Yu was very angry, and the smoke in her mouth rushed into her mouth, and she coughed. Su Lu said quietly, "Pregnant people should not smoke, drink, and drive fast in the future." Pregnant person, child, father. Although Su Lu didn't do it on purpose, these words had been repeated several times during this journey that seemed to have no destination. They drilled into Zhou Yu's ears and stimulated her mood. She finally couldn't hold it in anymore. With a gloomy face, she shouted loudly, "Shut up! What does this have to do with you?" At this time, the black car had just driven to a quiet side door of Linyuan. There were faint lights in the distance, but it was very quiet, and only the sound of forest insects and grass frogs could be heard. Above their heads, there were stars, and 2 moons hung on the 2 ends of the dark sky, which was very beautiful. "The reason why I was angry just now was because of you. This has nothing to do with me, but the child in your belly has something to do with me." Su Lu stared into her eyes and said, "Maybe you don't want to accept this life, but this is not your problem alone. I can't watch you drink and drive fast and in the end, lose your life and the life in your belly. Don't forget, the child's father is my best friend, so of course I can't allow you to do this." Zhou Yu was so angry that she laughed, and said with a cold smile, "Even if someone has to take care of this, it should be Shi Qinghai, that hooligan. You have no right to say anything." Su Le paused, and then slightly lowered his head and said, "This is indeed unfair to you, but Shi Qinghai is in a very dangerous situation right now. Under the circumstances that he doesn't know, if you choose not to have this child, it would be too unfair to him. I'm sorry, but after all, I am his best friend. Now you have 2 choices. One is to abort this child, and then hide this matter forever. But, now that I know, it will be very difficult for you to hide it from the whole world. Are you threatening me? How can you be so shameless?" Zhou Yu stared into his eyes in disbelief. Su Lu lowered his head even more. He had been thinking about this problem all along the way, but after thinking about it for a long time, he could only choose to use this kind of shameless method to threaten a girl who was naturally in a vulnerable position. This was not a kind way to deal with it, and it was not in line with his character, but it was definitely in line with the logic of an orphan in Donglin. In the eyes of orphans like him, there were many things that were most important. Chapter 160. I'm sorry. Su Lu raised his head and expressed his apology very seriously. Wangdu Hospital is inside Linyuan. If you don't want this child, I can send you there right now. And then you'll tell the Tai family or my father about this. Zhou Yu looked at him as if she wanted to eat him alive. Or you can choose the second option and give birth to the child. I'll take care of you during your pregnancy. Su Le thought for a moment and said very seriously, "Actually, you've been hesitating. Otherwise, you wouldn't have used alcohol and racing to try to cause some kind of accident. Since you also cherish the child in your belly, why don't you try to give birth to it? Give birth to it? What will happen after it's born?" Zhou Yu looked at Su Lu with a pale face and said sadly. In the social environment of the Federation, there were many single mothers. Moreover, there was social assistance, so they rarely faced superficial discrimination. However, the problem was that Zhou Yu was not the daughter of an ordinary family. "I'll think of a way to find Shi Qinghai." After saying this, Su Le got out of the car and left Zhou Yu alone in the car to make the most difficult choice. He quietly leaned against the heavy car door, lit up Mr. Shi's favorite cigarette, and took a deep breath. Shi Qinghai was his brother. He was an orphan and a fugitive pursued by the Federation government. He was in deep water and doing business on the edge of a knife. He might die silently one day. Su Le had been worried about him all this time. Now, unexpectedly, he found out that Shi Qinghai actually had an unborn child and a descendant. Su Le was very moved. He really wanted Shi Qinghai's child to survive. As an orphan, he cherished his descendants more than most people in the Federation. He didn't want Mr. Shi to die without any descendants. It was this strong feeling that made him follow Zhou Yu all the way to the entrance of Qingshan Park and have a conflict with those people. Therefore, he wanted to threaten Zhou Yu. In fact, if the daughter of the Zhou family in the car really chose to have an abortion, he would only hide this matter in the bottom of his heart forever. The two people inside and outside the car quietly looked at the lights of Wangdu Hospital in the distance. In the time it took to smoke a cigarette, they both made up their minds. Zhou Yu did not get out of the car, which meant that she had made a decision. "If I really didn't want this child, I think you probably wouldn't have spread this matter to everyone," Zhou Yu said coldly without looking at him as she gently fiddled with the slightly damp hair on her forehead. After a moment of silence, Su Le nodded and said, "In the end, it's still you who can't bear to part with this child." Zhou Yu's eyes were no longer as charming as usual. Instead, they were much softer. She didn't know what she was reluctant to part with. Her first man had died a long time ago. Although the case had never been solved, she knew that the male student, whom she didn't like very much, had actually died under the gun of her own brother. In fact, before she knew she was pregnant, she already had the existence of that beautiful man in her mind. Through her family's channels, she also knew that he was a spy for the anti-government army and was currently wanted by the Federation government. This was very good. At least she didn't have to worry about whether or not that hooligan would be killed by the army sent by her family. He probably wouldn't have any way to survive in the Federation. Zhou Yu laughed softly. Her laughter was filled with loneliness and mockery. She turned her head and looked at Su Le with a very strange gaze. She said softly, "Since you think you're his good brother and want to participate in this matter, then if there's any trouble in the future, you'll have to shoulder it." The girl in red, Zhou Yu, was the incomparably pampered daughter of the Minister of National Defense, Zhou Yingxing. She was the younger generation that even the madam of the Tai family liked very much. Regardless of whether she ran away from home or refused to return in a fit of pique, as time passed, the news of her pregnancy could not be hidden forever. When the time came, whether it was the Zhou family or the Tai family, they would probably ask who the child's father was. Shi Qinghai continued to be his spy and was being chased by the Federation. Naturally, it was impossible for him to be the child's father. Although this was the truth was often the most troublesome. At this moment, Zhou Yu's words with a cold smile were equivalent to giving Su Le a difficult problem. If he wanted to interfere in this matter, how could he withstand the pressure? At this moment, the car had already started moving slowly. It left the beautiful nighttime Linyuan of Wangdu Hospital and headed in the direction of the highway. Su Le's hands were placed steadily on the steering wheel. It seemed that his shoulders weren't very broad and solid. She didn't know if he could carry it. He didn't answer Zhou Yu's question because he was used to doing rather than talking. Since he had already chosen to protect Shi Qinghai's child, there were some troubles that had to be faced. The black car had not yet reached the highway intersection. Zhou Yu seemed to be a little unaccustomed to the silence in the car. She frowned and asked, "Where do you live?" "Wangdu." "What are you doing in the capital?" "Work." "What work?" "I just joined the Shell Motor Company's spring recruitment today. I should be entering the research institute." Hearing this answer, Zhou Yu's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise. Her family had always been in the military system, so she naturally knew the requirements of the Shell Motor Company. In particular, she felt a trace of surprise and a little admiration for this inconspicuous guy beside her who could actually enter the research institute. But in the blink of an eye, the surprise in her eyes turned into a somewhat strange smile. Su Lo was a taciturn fellow, but his brain was actually pretty good. When he heard Zhou Yu's question, he knew that the other party was going to give him another difficult question. However, he only gave a faint smile, not minding it at all. After all, it was only right to do something for a friend. An engineer from the Shell Motor Company. Although this identity can't be approved by my family, at least it doesn't sound too bad. Zhou Yu looked at him with a faint smile. Su Le smiled and said, I'm afraid this kind of trick won't be able to fool your family. That's why I'm not going back to the special region today. I'm going to your house. After Zhou Yu said this, her whole body relaxed. She leaned against the very comfortable driver's seat and squinted her eyes to look at the silent night outside the window. Su Lu hesitated for a moment and directly replied, okay. Such a clean and decisive response made Zhou Yu feel surprised again. She stared blankly at Su Li's side profile. She didn't understand why this guy who she didn't know was willing to do this. Could it really be because of the father of the child in her belly? But didn't he know that doing this would cause a lot of trouble? Think carefully. This isn't some romantic movie, she said with a cold smile. Su Lo paused for a moment and smiled. He thought to himself that he was just a little hot-blooded, not melodramatic. The moment he hesitated before answering, he had already sorted out all the problems. He didn't care about the small troubles that might occur in the future. He also didn't care about the misunderstanding between friends and the possibility of an irreversible plot. Whether it was Shi Qinghai or Tai Ziyuan, they were all very rational and calm people. Their IQs were not lower than 70. The child in the belly of the girl beside him had to be alive. Mr. Shi had to have a descendant. The whole thing was that simple. After the child is born, let me be the godfather, Su Le said. Zhou Yu looked at him with a complicated expression. She felt that she couldn't understand this ordinary guy. What kind of experience did he have to grow up to be such a person? On a flat area about 7 kilometers away from the 3rd recruit base of the Ministry of National Defense, a few black cars were parked on a flat area under the hill. It was early spring, but the place was still very cold. Tai Ziyuan tightened his windbreaker. He looked at the silhouette of the military base in the distance and couldn't help but take a deep breath. His eyes were still calm, but they started to show a sense of determination. According to the original plan, he would use a year to finish his studies at Yue University before entering the Silan military district. He would throw himself into the front lines of the battle against the Empire's border troops, laying a solid foundation for his destined extraordinary life. At the very least, he would need to complete the blank part of the military. However, after the assassination in Linhai State, Tai Ziyuan changed the location of his military service from the Westwoods military district to the S2 region, near the 4 states of Green Dragon Mountain. This decision was made by him alone. Other than his wife, not many people could understand his thoughts. At this time, the phone rang. Tai Ziyuan looked at the caller ID and couldn't help but smile. He hadn't received a call from that guy for many days. He didn't know how his recruitment exam in the capital was going. He was very clear about his abilities, so he wasn't worried and didn't think of calling. Through the phone, the expression on Tai Ziyuan's thin and pale face changed slightly. He was a little shocked, a little angry, and a little surprised. In the end, it turned into a bitter smile. After hanging up the phone, he was silent for a long time. He was very satisfied with Su Li's call. He was very shocked about the news of Yuzi's pregnancy. He was a little angry about the true identity of the child's father. This was a kind of anger that only men could understand. Although Tai Ziyuan didn't think about having anything with Zhou Yu, he still felt down when he found out that the girl in red who always liked him suddenly had a child with that rogue spy. If it wasn't for Su Lu running back to Linhai, that person called Shi Qinghai would have died. Maybe it would have been better. Tai Ziyuan thought silently. Then, he handed the phone to butler Jean, who had been quietly waiting behind him, and said slowly, if Sula calls, there are some things that I need your help with." "Yes, young master," Butler Jean answered quietly. Tai Yuan took his luggage from the car and carried it on his back. Under the gazes of the 10 or so core members of the Tai family, he walked along the mountain road and headed towards the military base in the distance. After walking for a long time, he waved his hand and flagged down a bus that was passing through the military base. Butler Jean silently watched his gradually disappearing figure. His heart was filled with mixed feelings. Young master finally took his first step. It was just that he had to hide his identity and work hard at the bottom of the second military region. Who knew how much pain he would have to go through? The bus stopped beside Tai Yuan. The driver, who was smoking a cigarette, looked at him with an unfriendly expression and asked loudly, "New melon?" Chapter 161. When the bus disappeared at the end of the road, Butler Jean retracted his worried gaze and boarded the bus with more than 10 members of the Tai family. In the car, the white-haired old man closed his eyes and began to recuperate. In name, he was Tai Yuan's personal butler, but in reality, he had a lot of power in his hands. There were several groups that were directly responsible to him. At this moment, the old man had a feeling of depression and anxiety that he couldn't get rid of. However, there was also a faint sense of pride. These feelings were all because of Tai Yuan's choice. Maybe history will judge me to be wrong, but I will never admit that I was wrong. On the night when Tai Yuan decided to join the second military region instead of going to the front lines in the West Woods, he smiled and said this in front of Lady Tai and Butler Jean. This was the confession of the Deputy Minister of National Defense, Yang Jingsong, before he died. Because of the Linhai State Gymnasium incident, 7 officers from the second military region committed suicide. The Deputy Minister of National Defense also committed suicide. Although the entire Federation was very satisfied with the agreement between Representative Pabre and Green Dragon Mountain, within the military, there were still some unfriendly feelings towards the Tai family. Even though Tai Yuan knew that it was a dangerous place, he still insisted on going there. On one hand, as the successor of the Tai family, he really admired those soldiers who tried to assassinate him. On the other hand, he knew very well that only by being in the same position for a few years could the soldiers of the second military region truly resolve their resentment towards the Tai family. He would definitely step onto the political stage in the future, so he had to resolve the issue with the second military region very well. Without a doubt, this was a very risky decision. That was why the wrinkles beside Butler Jin's tightly shut eyes showed his worry. After a while, he slowly opened his eyes and looked at the phone in his hand with a gaze that seemed to be able to see through people's thoughts. He thought about the call that his young master received before he left and frowned. The call was from Su Lu. Butler Jean had no idea that Zhou Yu was pregnant. All he could think about was Su Lu, the seemingly ordinary young man. From the old man's point of view, Su Lu had always possessed a kind of craftiness or intuition that belonged to the lower class. This ability had always been hidden under that calm and sincere face, which made the old man feel a little uneasy. Being the young master's friend would definitely bring more benefits than being his subordinate. This was not a difficult question, but very few people could see it clearly and dared to bet on it. Spring in the capital special district was so gentle. Whether it was the wind on the streets, the rain in the afternoon, the sun at dusk, or the flowers that were just beginning to stretch their waists, they were all moving slowly and delicately, without a hint of wild enthusiasm. A black car with an ordinary license plate without a logo slowly moved along the streets. In the driver's seat, Su Lu, who was wearing a military uniform, squinted his eyes and observed the capital streets outside the car window. He saw many buildings that he had only seen in postcards. These buildings were of different styles, but they all exuded a faint sense of solemnity. This was the core political district of the Human Federation for tens of thousands of years. It seemed that every brick and every metal wall reflected the light of history and glory, and breathed in the aura of authority and solemnity. When he was mixing in with the orphans in the Donglin district, Su Lu never thought that his life's dream would come true one day. He could actually drive a car and slowly drive in the most central district of the Human Federation, and he was also one of these people. However, after his dream became reality, his original dream had already changed. The goal he was looking for was no longer the same as it was in the beginning. A faint sense of oppression enveloped his heart, making his breathing a little uncomfortable. Subconsciously, he tugged at the button on his collar. It had been a few days, but he still hadn't gotten used to the military uniform he was wearing. After a day of training at the Shell Motor Company, he became an official staff member of the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute. However, he didn't expect that after entering the Federation, he would have to take on a military position. Although it was only a civilian officer, he was under the dual management of the company and the Ministry of Defense. Today, Sulu was already a first lieutenant in the Federation. Life was really a wonderful thing. Back then, passing the mechanic officer exam of the Ministry of Defense or joining the Shell Motor Company were two of Su Li's dreams. Now, it seemed that in a sense, he had realized these two dreams at the same time. However, because of the death of Uncle Fengyu, Zhang Xiaming's death, and many other things that happened after that, he had long lost his initial yearning and respect for the Federation government and the military. Following Hawking Avenue and bypassing the thick and cold building of the Ministry of Finance, the black car drove toward the northern suburbs of the capital. When it passed by an extremely quiet intersection, Su Li's eyes narrowed. His pupils contracted slightly, but he didn't slow down the speed of the car in the slightest. It was a road that was rumored to have no exits. At the end of the road was the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation. The sign at the intersection didn't say anything, only a few lines of warning and control. The back of Su Li's neck went slightly numb at this moment, as if there was a chill rising from his heart. His brows furrowed, and he mobilized the scorching heat in his body to circulate around his body, driving the chill out. He knew that it wasn't that something had happened to his chip at this moment and that the omnipotent central computer of the Bureau of Proclamation had discovered something. It was the greatest fear in his heart that made it difficult for him to calm down. The mysterious Bureau of Proclamation was the existence that Sula feared the most in the Federation. However, he also felt that one day, he would drive a car along that road that had no exits and have some sort of relationship with the Bureau of Proclamation. The car with a pass on it easily passed through the entrance control of the first military academy of the Federation. It went around the quiet passageway beside the Lotus Pond and passed through 2 checks before arriving at the 3rd department of the Shell Motor Company Research Institute. When Sula first came to the Research Institute, he also felt that it was a bit strange. He didn't expect the 3rd department of the Shell Motor Company Research Institute to be located on the campus of the 1st Military Academy. Later, he gradually understood that the Husk Institute was a very liberal department. The main research topics were all research and development with well-known professors from various universities. Therefore, the Shell Motor Company simply set up a few research institute branches in various universities to facilitate the work of the old professors. It was also because of this reason that the Federation government required the staff in the Research Institute to be transferred to military positions in order to strengthen their control of this area. Of course, the old professors were excluded. Walking from the parking lot to the quiet building, the contact between the insulating material floor and the soles of the military boots made monotonous sounds. Su Lu took a piece of bread and ate it as he walked towards his own area. In the long corridor, he only met 2 colleagues. They just nodded and greeted each other before leaving. The Research Institute of the Shell Motor Company gathered the top talents in the entire Federation. Excellent scholars and experts could be found everywhere. In the most important department of the Federation, all the staff were focused on their own research. Therefore, the usual greetings were extremely rare. In the past 10 days, Sula had already gotten used to this kind of atmosphere. Coincidentally, he was also a person who was as quiet as gold, so he actually liked it. However, he didn't notice that the 2 researchers who walked past him turned around and looked at him with sympathy in their eyes. He took out the electronic door card and opened the heavy door. In front of the second door, his whole body was scanned by a light blue light, especially by the chip. After his access was approved, the real door opened. A large operation room that looked like a warehouse appeared in front of Su Li's eyes. From the most precise bald head tools to the largest alloy cutting equipment, from the Federation's most powerful processor to a storage device that was about the size of 3 bookshelves and stored a large amount of blueprints and data, everything that appeared in front of Su Li's eyes was completely in line with his life's ideals. However, he didn't know why, but there wasn't a trace of excitement on his face. Instead, there was a faint sense of tiredness. The equipment was covered in a layer of dust. The images displayed on the holographic screen on the table were constantly changing. The faint sound of electrical current in the storage device was so beautiful. Su Lu stared blankly at all this and couldn't help but smile bitterly. The automatic dust removal device hadn't been used for a long time. The equipment in this warehouse was so expensive, but it was placed so casually. Su Lu shook his head. If he had enough time, relying on the manufacturing equipment, data, and materials here, he was even confident that he could assemble a mecha. However, he didn't have the time to do this. He didn't even have the time to clean this room. Pulling out a piece of paper, he wiped the table and carefully placed the remaining half of the bread on the clean table. Su Lu took off his military uniform and threw it on a chair. Then, as if warming up before a fight, he moved his neck and the joints of his hands. Taking a deep breath, he squatted in front of the table and stared at the image on the table. The display terminal of the warehouse's computer was on this table. It was about 1 meter wide and 2.5 meters long. The image on the screen rotated slowly, giving people a very comfortable visual enjoyment. However, Su Lu was as cautious as if he was facing the cruelest enemy in his life. Right at this moment, an old and calm voice rang out in the warehouse. It was calm but spoke quickly. This voice didn't greet Su Lu and directly issued a work order. Second, 3 sets of incompatible data. Laser state transition diagram. QED data. A dozen orders were issued in a row. Su Lu listened in silence. His hands had already begun to move quickly on the table. From the massive amount of data in the internal memory, he found an entry that matched the requirements. However, because the data requested by the voice was final data, the fields involved were the most cutting-edge fields in the Federation's scientific community that hadn't matured yet, so there was no ready-made data. He looked for suitable mathematical tools, borrowed the computer's powerful computing power, and summarized the data. According to the other party's request, he carried out the final image process. In other words, Su Li's current job was to use the shortest amount of time to convert the complex data system into simple data support that could be easily used to draw conclusions. Half an hour later, Su Lu finally finished the first task. His fingertips pressed the light block on the table and sent the result over. However, he didn't even have time to wipe the sweat off his forehead before he immediately started the second task. From the first day he entered the research institute, Su Lu was engaged in this kind of boring work. He finally understood why the research institute suddenly had the idea of snatching people from the shell spring recruitment. This kind of research processing role was really not easy. Even with Su Li's physical strength and brain power, he almost couldn't handle it. The owner of the old voice wasn't Professor Shen, who went to the Shell Motor Company to snatch people. It was Professor Shen's father. An old monster who was respectfully called Old Shen by the Research Institute staff. An old monster. Only Old Shen and Su Lu were in this storage room of the 3rd Division of the Research Institute. It was said that during the peak of the research period, there were a total of more than 10 research assistants in this storage room. However, in the end, not a single one of them was able to persevere. They all requested to be transferred away. A few of them even resigned to go through strict military scrutiny to leave the Husk Institute. Su Lu mechanically and numbly organized the data, but his mind was thinking about other things. He knew that Professor Shen's research direction was in the field of quantum measurable dynamics. The problem was that all the experts in the Federation agreed that this was a dead end. There would never be an exit, just like the special road that led to the Bureau of Proclamation. There was no time to research the chip, to come into contact with the Federation's most mysterious charter technology. He couldn't even personally touch the mechanical aspects of mecha battleships. All day long, he was faced with this vague data that he couldn't even understand. accompanying an eccentric old professor to research something that would never yield results. Su Le suddenly had doubts about his own choice. Chapter 162. In the past, Su Le had spent a lot of time in the library of Yue University, reading all kinds of books and unofficial historical commentaries, so he was able to recognize the faces of a few old men from the Federation. These top figures in the scientific and cultural field of the Federation were either honorary directors in some institute or were worshipped like ancestors in some university. Electronic gossip magazines loved to write about people, especially celebrities, such as Jian Shuier, certain politicians, and that mature female anchor on the news channel of the Federation. The academic gossip magazines that were subsidized by the education fund of the Federation actually had the same hobby. However, the words "wrong" in the "wrong" were all removed. They just blindly grabbed idols from the ivory tower to attract the ordinary readers who were fascinated by the mysterious and unknown scientific cult. The older the idols, the better. Just smearing gold dust on these old scholars was probably not enough to satisfy the peeping desire of the Federation citizens. Therefore, the biographical articles in the academic journals always described these old men as strange people. No matter whether these old men were historians or astrophysicists, in these articles, they were all old fools who were cooked in a pot and walked around like ghosts. The old professor that Su Le was following now had the surname Professor Shen and the name Yufei. It was the name of a typical gigolo. However, he knew that Professor Shen was not a gigolo. In the past 10 days, he had met this old professor 3 times. Su Le faintly felt that this old professor looked familiar. It was only later that he remembered that he had seen this old man's picture in several academic journals. He had also read the related biographies. Su Le had never believed that these top old scholars in the Federation were all strange people. In his opinion, the scholars who could be in these academic journals were definitely experts. Although he was an unorthodox engineer, he respected these old men very much. He even faintly admired them. Today, when he was next to these top experts in the Federation, he was shocked to find that the non-academic biographies in the academic journals were not all fake. The old men's temperament was indeed a bit strange. In the past, when he looked at them from afar, he could see that they were strange mountains and rocks. Now that he was close to them, he realized that they were actually difficult mountain roads. In the main research and control room, Su Le would always be busy for a long time. He did not have time to do what he wanted to do. Those difficult theories were things that he could not fully understand at the moment. He needed to retrieve data and diagrams, as well as search for related information in the vast literature library. For the current him, it was very difficult work. There was no creativity, and he could not come into contact with any real research topics. All he did was help. He was more like a humanoid computer sorting, not a research assistant. It was no wonder that with Professor Shen's status in the academic world, there were no other researchers in the laboratory today except for Su Le. It was also no wonder that the young Professor Shen would so impulsively run to the spring recruitment exam site to snatch people. Presumably, the young Professor Shen was also forced into a corner by the old Professor Shen. The work that Su Le did every day seemed simple, but in fact, it was very complicated and tiring. The most important thing was that it was boring. Just like Linhai Prefecture in the middle of winter, the 4 seasons of the Donglin region, when it snowed, it would last for several months. When the sky darkened, it would last for an entire year. There was no change at all. Fortunately, Su Le was a person who was used to silence and had a calm temperament. Like a stone, he silently and steadily completed the work that the old professor gave him in front of the holographic screen table. Even though there were occasional feelings of disappointment in his heart, they disappeared in the blink of an eye. He didn't complain, and he didn't even think about leaving the research institute. To be honest, the staff he had seen in the past 10 days were less than the stray cats he had seen in the Donglin district's mine. Even if he wanted to complain, he couldn't find a suitable target. He washed the hair of the Zhong family's daughter, took a bullet for the young master of the Tai family, and scared the young master of the Li family with his car. At this time, in Su Li's eyes, the 7 most mysterious and powerful families of the Federation no longer had any halos. Environment and experience were the most difficult to change a person's mind. At this time, Su Li was very sure that he was not an ordinary person, but he also knew that in addition to the chip and the tyrannical mysterious power in his body, his biggest reliance was the technology in his brain. And to understand these 3 things, even Tai Ziyuan could not help much. It was still that old saying, only technology could get close to technology. Su Li knew very well that this old Professor Shen Yufei definitely would not set these difficult questions to test him just because he liked him too much. Then, one day, there would be a golden flash and the old professor would pass on his entire legacy to him, and then die. This was not a dream, this was a wet dream in the military camp, an obscene fantasy that deserved a beating. He was only sure that if he wanted to get close to the core technology of the Federation, he would need to stay by this old professor's side and follow these old gentlemen. Just bear with it for now, Su Li thought in his heart, but the speed of his hands did not slow down at all. Looking at his 10 fingers that were about to become afterimages before his eyes, he subconsciously began to daydream. He thought to himself that if he had to bear with this for another half a year, when he was operating a mecha in the future, his hand speed would really be amazing. This boring assistant job actually did have some benefits. As for what the hell the hand speed had to do with mecha, of course that only existed in Su Li's daydreaming. The benefit he could clearly feel was that he was already becoming more and more familiar with handling this massive and complex database. He believed that in another 2 months' time, this database would be like those components piled up in the operations room of the mine. No matter how complicated the process was, it would not be a problem for him. Professor Shen's research on quantum measurable dynamics was too cutting-edge, so much so that it was publicly acknowledged that there was no future for it. However, precisely because there was no future for it, the data required encompassed many aspects. It was like a blind cat trying to kill a mouse. It would definitely be blindly bumping around on a 2-dimensional plane at 360 degrees. The 3 divisions of the Research Institute were set up in the first military academy and shared the same database. Professor Shen's position, as well as the 360 degrees of blindly bumping around that position, was enough for him to enter most of the areas. As the only assistant, Su Li could already faintly see the shape of a treasure mountain, shining brightly. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the Research Institute got off work punctually. There were still many researchers who had not completed their research projects, so they would still remain in their own labs. However, Su Li had already packed up his belongings neatly, put on his military cap, typed his farewells on the desktop, and left the storage room immediately. Before he left, he glanced at the row of Federation cutting-edge equipment covered in fine dust and could not help but sigh. He thought to himself that he would definitely find some time tomorrow to come out and fix the dust removal equipment. It was fine as long as he completed his own work. There was no need to spend all his time with that old man. Su Li would leave punctually every day. In fact, he had also thought that if he could work overtime here, he might really be able to find something after Professor Shen left. However, he really did not have much time now. Not long after that black car left the first military academy, Professor Shen also walked out of the lab with the help of his crutches. He got into his son's car outside the entrance of the Research Institute. Young Professor Shen noticed that his father did not look very good, but he was not surprised. Ever since his father devoted himself to the research of quantum measurable dynamics 10 years ago, this had already become a fact that was destined to happen. Young Professor Shen could not help but sigh in his heart. With his father's status in the scientific community of the Federation and his identity as a Nebula Award winner, in the last few years of his life, he had entered a dead end. As a son and student, he was really disappointed. However, he also knew that people who engaged in scientific research were stubborn. No one could persuade each other. "Is the new assistant okay?" Young Professor Shen subconsciously asked. Many years ago, he and his father rarely talked about anything other than academic topics. "Very good." Professor Shen's eyes were half closed. His hands were pressed on the crutches. The age spots on his face were very obvious. On his soft cheeks, there were 2 patches of yellow that did not look auspicious. Young Professor Shen was slightly stunned. He did not expect that his eccentric father would give such a high evaluation of the research assistant. Although it was only 2 words, when was the last time someone received such an evaluation? Impeccable when he works. Old Professor Shen seemed to be interested. He slowly opened his somewhat cloudy eyes, coughed twice, and said regretfully, although I was not very familiar with the classification of subjects in the beginning, this kid is very smart and willing to work hard. The problem is that he gets off work on time every day. It makes me very unhappy. It seems that he is a person with a girlfriend. It is really stupid of him to fall in love so early and waste his time. During the spring recruitment exam in nutshell, Professor Shen Jr. had chosen Su Lu on behalf of his father at first glance. It was because of Su Li's meticulous and logical ability on the test paper, as well as the leap of thought in the last big question, as well as the extraordinary hands-on ability that Professor Zhou from Yue University had mentioned. Young Professor Shen was also very satisfied that his father was satisfied with him. However, when he heard his father's last sentence, he could not help but be silent. He thought to himself, if young people do not fall in love, what else can they do? Su Lu did not have a girlfriend. Even if he did, in his heart, she had already turned into a few balls of fire in the sky above S2. She melted into the clouds and disappeared with the wind. Now, he was naturally not in the mood to fall in love. Whether it was the problem in his body or Senator Macklin, who was in full swing with the presidential election, both made him more silent than before. The automatic thermal soup pot began to sound. Su Lu scooped out the soup and carefully placed it on the dining table. He then went to the kitchen to cook a few side dishes and 2 bowls of rice. Only then did he sit at the table and began to focus on eating. A red figure appeared in the living room. Miss So family was wearing a light red halter top today. She looked very cool. She was a little tired as she sat across from him. She looked at the dishes in front of her and said, "You really are a person who is not afraid of trouble." The soup was made by Su Lu before he left in the morning. The dishes were bought from the supermarket the night before yesterday. Su Lu raised her head in confusion, glanced at her, and asked hesitantly, "What's the trouble? Why don't you eat the ready-made food?" Zhou Yu scooped up a chicken claw in the soup and frowned, "You can be considered a little rich now. It shouldn't be a problem for you to eat at a restaurant." Chapter 163. Speaking of synthetic meat, I've always had a question. You're now a member of the Husk Institute, so I can ask you about it. Zhou Yu looked at him and asked, "The Federation's synthetic meat fibers have been in use for many years now. Why haven't we seen any applications for them in other areas? For example, in the area of mecha linkage devices." Zhou Yu, who was wearing a red halter top, sat quietly across from Su Lu and asked seriously. In her opinion, since this ordinary-looking but eccentric young man was able to enter the most advanced research institute in the Federation, he naturally had some areas worth learning from. Su Li's fingers froze in the middle of picking up food. Only then did he remember that the girl's father was the Deputy Minister of National Defense. Although not all families of generals could produce tiger girls, they rarely produced trash. At least this question seemed ridiculous, but in reality, it was a very important matter. I've never been able to get through the ethics committee, and the most important thing is that protein cannot withstand high temperatures, and whether it's mecha or other mechanical equipment, being able to withstand high temperatures is a basic requirement. A few days ago, when he was helping Professor Shen organize some information, Su Lu had seen a few famous biochemical hybrid experiments in the 23rd constitutional calendar. In that grand experiment that lasted 40 years, countless failures proved that this idea could never become a reality. He raised his head and looked at the girl in red, or perhaps it should be called the girl in red now. Who knew how many thoughts flashed through his mind at the same time? Zhou Yu was not wearing any makeup today. Her features were more delicate, and her shoulders were exposed beyond the 2 thin straps. Her entire person was languid, but there was only calmness, a calmness that seeped out from her bones. She picked up the food on her plate with her chopsticks. Her movements were silent and natural. Whether she raised her hand or not, she always appeared so elegant and quiet. Su Lu looked at her, and his two knife-like eyebrows gradually rose. There was a strange look in his eyes. After these few days of interaction, he confirmed that this girl, who was not yet 20, was not as difficult to get along with as he had thought. It could even be said that she had a good upbringing. Speaking of which, how could a daughter-in-law that could be chosen by Lady Tai be a bitch with heavy makeup? Su Le just did not understand why the Zhou he saw in Linhai was a completely different person. She was a disgusting woman who was cold and arrogant to the extreme. He could not figure it out no matter how he thought about it. He could only sigh and admit that women were indeed the most elusive creatures in this world. It had been more than 10 days. In these 10 days, Zhou had been staying in Su Li's rented apartment, watching TV and surfed the internet to kill time. Perhaps it was because of her pregnancy, but she always looked so tired. Su Lu was also a quiet person. In addition, they were not very happy to see each other, so these days, the two of them did not talk much. After being stared at by Su Lu for so long, of course Zhou knew, but she did not react at all. She just obediently finished the rice in her bowl, drank the high-energy protein powder that Su Lu had prepared for her beforehand, and ate a folic acid tablet. Then she smiled at Su Lu and said, "Do I look good?" Zhou did not mind being stared at. She was born beautiful, and since she was young, she had always been the center of attention. However, in the past, the unscrupulous people who dared to stare at her around the 3rd Military Region either had their legs broken or were thrown into the cold winter river. These past few years of life experience had turned this girl into a person who used coldness and indifference to hide her frustration. However, ever since that night, sitting in that black car and following this small-eyed boy in front of her back to this ordinary apartment, Zhou suddenly realized that such a peaceful home life was not all that bad. It was just that this whole thing was really ridiculous. Zhou often wondered what kind of person Su Lu was. She had seen bored men who were willing to stab themselves a few times out of loyalty to their brothers, but a man who took over everything so calmly and was not afraid of any troubles or misunderstandings was really rare. Although Su Li's eyes were small, they were often squinted, just like when he was staring at her blankly right now. Strangely, there was no coldness or harshness in those eyes, nor was there any discomforting emotion. There was only a faint smile, not sincere, but also amiable and trustworthy. Anyone who spent some time with Su Lu would fall in love with this quiet young man, and it was not the romantic type. Zhou was no exception, so the words, "Do I look good?" made people feel uneasy and had a deeper meaning. "You look good." Su Lu nodded and said sincerely. The eldest daughter of the Zhou family, who was not wearing any makeup, was more than enough to be called beautiful. Her facial features were not suitable for heavy makeup to begin with. It was only suitable for light application. Coupled with the serenity between her eyebrows at this moment, she was even more beautiful. This answer did not surprise Zhou. Even a person who was not direct would know when to say something direct to cover up. But the problem now was that she did not understand what this seemingly ordinary young man in front of her was hiding. Or to put it more deeply, she did not even know if he was hiding anything. At the entrance of Qingshan Park, Su Lu called out and knocked over a car. She followed him. Outside the Linyuan of Wangdu Hospital, Su Lu smoked a cigarette outside the car. She thought about it for a while in the car and did not get out. She followed him directly to this inconspicuous apartment. Zhou believed that she was a clear-headed person. She was willing to follow Su Lu, aside from some thoughts that could not be exposed in front of others, mostly because of the little life in her belly. No matter what kind of woman she was, at the moment of her first pregnancy, she would succumb to her instincts, or rather, succumb to her secreted hormones. A greater woman would have such a thing as maternal love, so they would be sentimental, sensitive, and give birth to a tigress who would not care about anything. Zhou became ruthless, so she ran away from home, washed away her lead, and hid in this apartment to prepare for the birth of her child. She had been sentimental before, so when she saw Su Li's black car on Highway 2, she would cry like a black cloud destroying a city. But now that everything had settled down temporarily, it was difficult to calm down her increasingly sensitive mind. She had her own reasons for the situation in front of her, but what about him? Was it really because the child in her belly was the descendant of his brother? Zhou Yu sipped the sticky protein powder and frowned slightly. She did not deliberately hide the cautious gaze she shot at Su Lu. It was still the same saying. It was common to be limited by the so-called loyalty. Because of a moment of hot-bloodedness, it was rare to be able to protect someone gently for a long time, not tired of trouble, and not be disloyal. Zhou Yu tilted her head slightly and looked at Su Lu with interest. These days, Su Lu had looked up a lot of things on the internet and took very good care of her. Whether it was cooking or washing, he did not show any reluctance or boredom. Looking at his behavior, it seemed as if he was prepared to protect her for as long as he could not find Shi Qinghai. However, at this time, both the man and woman at the table knew that it was not easy for Shi Qinghai to come back openly. Everyone had seen thunder and lightning, but no one had seen water penetrate a stone with their own eyes. The latter was obviously not easy. Therefore, Zhou Yu was suspicious, Zhou Yu was puzzled, and Zhou Yu was a little depressed. I really find it hard to believe that there is someone like you in the Federation today. Zhou Yu did not say that he was such a person, because it was difficult to express clearly in words. It was probably a positive evaluation related to morality. You women don't know much about men's affairs. Su Lu said an old saying that was not liked by feminists. He explained with a smile, in my eyes, the women of my brothers are not women. Trouble related to my brothers is not trouble. These words were not crude, and neither was the reason. However, no matter which era, there were many people who believed in these simple principles, but there were only a few men who could truly put their brothers first and not seduce their wives. Su Lu did not know what he was doing now. In a certain time and space, there was a second master who did the same thing on a journey of thousands of miles. With his personality, he would just do what he did. He wasn't even willing to explain himself. However, when he looked at Zhou Yu's eyes, he knew that pregnant women were sensitive. He had no choice but to explain with a smile. Even if she was a very beautiful pregnant woman who had a grudge with him before, she was still a pregnant woman after all. The human rights of pregnant women were above everything else. This was a simple arithmetic problem, 2 to 1. Zhou Yu was not a stupid woman. Although she had done some stupid things in the past few years, that was because she wanted to do it. When she heard Su Li's words and looked into Su Li's eyes, she suddenly smiled and said softly, I really don't know if that hooligan surnamed Shi is lucky or if I am lucky. Although she said this lightly, Zhou Yu's eyes were filled with a faint sense of awe. She respected Su Li's actions, but she also feared Su Li's actions. There were very few people like him in the Federation. She wondered what kind of people he would become in the future. Su Lu smiled and did not respond. He naturally got up and prepared to wash the dishes. Now, all the housework in this simple apartment was done by him. Therefore, when he was working with Professor Shen in the Research Institute, he did not have much time and energy to enter the database to search for the things he wanted. Don't wash the dishes for now. Come with me for a walk. Don't just walk in the neighborhood today. I want to sit on the street. Su Lu hesitated for a moment and nodded. Zhou Yu had been very quiet for the past few days. She did not cause any trouble for him. She did her duty as a pregnant woman and did not even contact her bad friends. It was reasonable for him to accompany her for a walk. Pregnant women needed to exercise and relax. The young couple walked along the big tree below the apartment and slowly walked towards the brighter lights of the business district. After a long silence, Su Lu said with some shame, I am not good with words. I guess you have been a bit bored these past few days. If Mr. Shi was here, I don't think you would find it so boring. When she heard Shi Qinghai's name, Zhou Yu's expression changed slightly. She immediately returned to her usual cold and indifferent appearance in front of others. From the corner of her eyes, she caught a glimpse of a few figures in the dark at the entrance of the neighborhood. She could not help but frown. Those people were tall and sturdy. It seemed that they had no intention of hiding their whereabouts, but they also had no intention of coming forward. Su Lu looked over there and said, trouble is coming. This is a very natural thing. You can't take me to the triangle. Zhou tightened the pony around her shoulders and said with a slight ridicule, if you can really hide it from my family and let me give birth to the child, it will be a miracle. Su Lu was surprised that the Zhou family found out about Zhou Yu's whereabouts so quickly. After all, it was not difficult for the Minister of Defense to investigate a person in the capital special district. You said you were not afraid of trouble. Zhou Yu's hand slowly stroked her slightly bulging belly. Thinking about the tragedy of the child in her belly if she was caught by her family, her voice could not help but become cold. The key is your attitude. Su Lu looked at the guys who were obviously soldiers. He carefully held her arm and stepped over the metal railing at the entrance of the neighborhood. You're tuning into the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.